Hey, sovereign wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Live. We started slightly late today because I needed to break my fast, and it's a little bit different in terms of when the light comes down. So anybody else that was fasting today, Ramadan Mubarak. Otherwise, we're going to jump straight in with essentially the content of the dollar's last war, the end of the Bretton Woods order as we know it today. And so I think we are at a historical moment, and we're going to need to understand how we know when we have exited the Bretton Woods system. And we have already, but I want to go through the final three acts. So we're going to do this slightly differently today. We're going to be doing it in two parts. One's going to be an interview that I did earlier this week, and the other's going to be the content. And so in part one, I'm going to be going through the dollar's final three acts as global hegemon and what that looks like in order to manage this transition with everything that happened this week in both Bitcoin macro and geopolitics. And then in part two, we're going to be discussing sovereignty in a world of manufactured wars. Now, we're going to be doing something slightly different today. I was contacted by a fellow Bitcoiner that runs a podcast. Her name is Efrat Fenigson, and I found out that that she was born in Israel and worked for the IDF, but when we were talking, she was talking in a very different way. She left Israel, and we were talking about our belief that October the 7th was a manufactured inside job. And so I decided to accept the interview, and I'm going to be playing the interview. And I think it's important for us to bridge these different worlds and understand. And so I'm very curious about what you think about the interview, but we're going to be playing that one in part two. And we covered a lot of different things. Efran's experience as well from that. So that's what we're going to be doing today in Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. And so let's jump right in right now with part one, which is the dollar's final three acts as global hegemon. And what did we learn about this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics to indicate that these are the final three acts? So let's go through them one at a time. Act one is what I call constructing the programmable dollar and the Wall Street Bitcoin accumulation phase. This is what I've been talking about a long time. And essentially, what we're seeing is that the financial industrial complex started constructing all of the Bitcoin tools that are needed in order to do essentially to Bitcoin what it did to gold. It started creating the Bitcoin financial industrial complex. It started creating financial weapons of mass destruction. It started creating legislation in order to allow banks to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. It started using its investment banking network in order to infiltrate the community and create Bitcoin treasury companies and centralize as much Bitcoin as possible by using both the equity capital markets and the debt capital markets. It then started creating paper IOU Bitcoins and making it where people could essentially use ultra leverage in order to speculate on the short-term price of Bitcoin. It also started creating Bitcoin-backed loans so that you could put your Bitcoin in custody. You could borrow against your Bitcoin. They'd mine some fiat currency. And then if the price of Bitcoin goes down too far, they would margin call you and wipe out your Bitcoin or ask you to send them more Bitcoin. They would also want you to use perpetual futures in order to gamble on the price of Bitcoin rather than hold it in self-custody. And of course, they created custody services so that you're not running your own node and verifying your own transactions, so that you don't have the ability to be a sovereign individual using Bitcoin the way that it was designed. And what they essentially did is they managed to create over the last year the last few years through Operation Choke Point 2.0 under the Biden administration, and then crypto capital under the Trump administration, They constructed all the financial weapons of mass destruction so that essentially the financial industrial complex can manage the price of Bitcoin down during this transition phase so that they could buy the dip and they end up with more and more Bitcoin. And that's what essentially has been happening. That also included several FUD campaigns. For example, Jeffrey Epstein being the creator of Bitcoin. If you haven't watched last week's episode, make sure you check it out as well. But really, they used the Bitcoin derivative complex in order to manufacture the volatility and the margin calls in order to accumulate and get as much Bitcoin in custody as possible. Now, as we talked about last week, when I went through all the different types of ways of infiltrating Bitcoin, and that none of them have worked in their entirety, but we've had different pockets of tools that have been used. I believe at this stage, they've used their tools in order to suppress the price of Bitcoin so they could end up with as much Bitcoin as possible. With it, whether that's within ETFs or whether that's within strategy or whether that's within other treasury companies where their price has gone down so significantly. Fortunately, all the long-term listeners of Simon Dixon Hard Talk, we were warning everyone against these tools, and everyone was setting up their self-custody and running nodes and everything. But essentially, they found ways of getting as many Bitcoiners through the tax-efficient structures to put those Bitcoins in treasury companies so that they could issue fiat currency loans against it. And as we said, because Bitcoin is proof of work rather than proof of stake, they can't control it, the governance structure. And so they have to try and use different types of mechanisms for controlling the governance. And because Bitcoin has a developer community, a mining network, and a node network, all of those can't be co-opted at the same time. And I covered that in deep detail last week. But they have accumulated enough Bitcoin to control the short-term price of Bitcoin, oppress it to try and accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible, change the old 4-year cycle mechanism, and just really use Bitcoin as a tool for managing this transition by the financial industrial complex into this multipolar world order that we are entering into right now. And so I believe that they are manipulating the price to get some more favorable terms, and they believe that they can hold out longer than you can hold out. This was, everyone that's a long-term listener, you would have been warned about this long in advance and expecting it. And of course, you just have to play the same game as them. You have to be accumulating at lower prices, and you have to be holding it in self-custody. You don't borrow against it, so you don't get margin called. But the point is that just as they use gold and silver in order to push this transition into a multipolar world, while the financial industrial complex is breaking the Japan carry trade, breaking the mechanisms of the euro dollar, and breaking the mechanisms of the petrodollar, they are managing these types of outflows. And once they have accumulated the position that they want to accumulate, this becomes an important negotiation tool. And of course, I covered all of this last week, so I'm not going to go over too much ground. But all you need to do is continue to self-custody. And in order to maintain the integrity of the Bitcoin network, anyone that's willing to run nodes can participate in the future of the network as we get these different attack vectors as well. And so anyway, they haven't hijacked Bitcoin, as I covered, but make sure you check out the blog last week. But Bitcoin ETFs managed by BlackRock are now, in 2025, the most profitable ETF product that generated more fees for BlackRock than any of their other products. And so that's why they're managing this mechanism to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible, co-opt and try and get as many people to custody it with them, and then use it as a tool to control the short-term price. Now, we know where this ends. We know that Bitcoin in self-custody is in demand when you're creating these paper contracts on Bitcoin. And we know exactly what happened with gold and silver as well. But we also know that this is a more fixed supply asset. And so what are they doing while they're buying this time? Well, of course, we've had the introduction of firstly the Genius Act and then the Clarity Act. And Clarity Act essentially is using Bitcoin as a tool. So, Trump said we're going to have Bitcoin strategic reserves when all he's done is confiscated Bitcoin. And then said we're going to turn the world into crypto capital when all he's done is built stablecoin services, launched the Genius Act to create a favorable stablecoin regime for banks and financial institutions. But now we've got the Clarity Act in order to draft a full-blown surveillance state with programmable stablecoins that are issued by private issuers like World Liberty Financial, the Trump family and the Witkoff family enterprise that met this week, and all of the different tech bros, and of course the part that the Trump administration is most aligned with, the financial industrial complex in terms of the asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, the capital deployers, so that essentially you can have programmable money for the financial industrial complex and the technical industrial complex, all branded as an illusion that Trump is taking on the Fed because he's regime changing the Fed in order to get interest rates down. We'll cover a bit more about that in the second act. But it makes it look like to the MAGA people that there's a move to take on the Fed, and it's framed as crypto capital, making sure that America is the future of crypto, as it were. Now, anyone that's a long-term listener won't be falling for those narratives, but that is the narrative that's being framed as we usher in this programmable Orwellian 1984 nightmare of the programmable dollar that is being privatized and brought forward, and favorable regulations integrating that into the Bank Secrecy Act and giving favorable terms to the banks that are members of the Federal Reserve. And so with that in mind, there was a meeting this week for World Liberty Financial, which is Steve Witkoff's son and Donald Trump's son's subsidiary, that is essentially doing these side deals and building out their own version of a programmable stablecoin. And they decided there were industry players that met this week in Mar-a-Lago. This was representatives from both the crypto side, so the big crypto lobbies, whether it be people from Ripple Labs or Coinbase or various other companies that are partnered with banks or gone public and rely upon bank financing. And then members of the banking cartel that are interested in the faction of stable coins to give an advantage to the banks. And also stable coins from the perspective of tokenizing real world assets. The World Economic Forum of you will own nothing and be happy will be the custodians. You give us the asset, we'll give you a token, and then we'll program into it the fact that we can freeze them, the fact that they can be deletable, and the fact that we can program in the rules into these tokenized assets. And members of Congress. So they all met at Mar-a-Lago. Goldman Sachs was there. Franklin Templeton, an important fund manager, was there. There was, basically just different people from the crypto side. And it looks like the goal is to use Brian Armstrong as a bit of a proxy for Larry Fink, as I've covered in the past, and just usher in this whole, programmable money, tokenized real world assets, 1984 Orwellian nightmare, using both the Genius Act and the Clarity Act. And before that, you had the big, beautiful bill with Operation Stargate. You had Doge, which was all about bringing in the data for artificial intelligence. Then you've had open border, closed border, and the beta tests of using Palantir technology, part of the Stargate project and the Department of Government Efficiency data collection exercise. And then you've had this slow transition of X into freedom of reach, but not freedom of speech, in order to gradually move to this social credit score as X becomes a financial services platform integrated with the Bank Secrecy Act, and making sure that we're feeding the algorithms with all of that data. Well, anyway, the Clarity Act, they're trying to make it pass by April this year. But in reality, what is actually happening here? Well, the operation to strategically weaken the dollar to usher in this federal, to usher in this multipolar world, in the kind of the narrative of taking on the Fed, suing Jerome Powell, regime changing the Federal Reserve. But all of that does is it removes the perception that international markets rely upon that the Fed is independent of both the Treasury, so that monetary policy and fiscal policy are independent. And so when you take away independence, that's what's happened with currencies like in Turkey and various other countries that have been through this process. You lose faith in the dollar to preserve its value at the same time as it being weakened, at the same time as all these different operations to usher in this agent of chaos type of thing. And then the crypto capital side is building in the surveillance state at the same time. So essentially, the financial industrial complex is building the tools to persuade you to put as much Bitcoin in custody so that they can engage in financial weapons of mass destruction, to do price suppression, to accumulate more Bitcoin while they work on the other part of it, what they really want, which is the programmable dollar, privatized, and other nodes in the different networks launch their central bank digital currency. And also notice how we've got Genius Act, Clarity Act, and that was meant to be followed by the Anti-Central Bank Digital Currency Act. I doubt we'll get that one. We'll continue to watch this, but by the time we get to midterm elections, we might just be done. And so all we got in the end was ginormous fiscal dominance and the tools for the financial industrial complex and technical industrial complex. So you know that once the dollar becomes programmable, that is really the first stage of countries all around the world not wanting to use the dollar because they don't want that freeze function. Just like Russia, the de-dollarization movement was really marked when European banks and US banks seized Russian central bank reserve assets. And that led to this real acceleration of de-dollarization. Well, programmable dollar will be the next phase of that as well. And so that leads us into, that's the first act in order to manage this transition where the dollar becomes a regional currency and we end the Bretton Woods system. The second act is what I'm calling the debt rollover strategy. And so we switched from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. And it's not been called quantitative easing because instead of purchasing long-term, 10-year, treasuries, US government treasuries, they've been buying short-term bills, which is, a treasury with a short-term expiry date. It has a lower interest rate because you're lending to the US government for a shorter period of time. Whereas if you're going to lend for like 5 years, 10 years, up to 30 years, you have to pay a higher interest rate. But the demand for these higher interest rate, higher term loans and bonds has been decreasing, but the demand for the short-term bonds has been increasing. Now, the problem is that we've been covering over the long term that the foreign buyers, you've got Japan that's still left, and then after that, you've got Europe, and China's been decreasing. And as the dollar gets weaker and weaker, and the gold price goes up further and further in dollar terms, you're getting more and more breaks of the pegs and deviation from foreign investors into holding those dollar reserves. Now, it's still the largest currency in the world, but it's below gold already in terms of market capitalization. And then you've got the euro as the runner-up after that. But everyone's moving to gold. And we covered this 2 weeks ago when we went through the psychological, not formal gold standard, but when people are now holding their reserves in gold, the impact that that has. We covered that a couple of weeks ago as well. But anyway, what did we see this week? We saw, again, another quantitative easing, but not called quantitative easing, because rather than buying the long-term treasuries, they were buying the short-term bills. And so we apparently don't call that quantitative easing. But the Federal Reserve just pumped essentially $18.5 billion into the US banking system through these overnight repos. Essentially, when you want to borrow overnight, you're a bank and you need instant liquidity. You get a collateralized loan from the Federal Reserve overnight. You deposit some of your treasuries at the Federal Reserve. They hold them as collateral. And then they issue you a repo loan, which needs to be repaid with a bit more interest the next day. And we also saw another one of those this week, approximately $8 billion. Now, if you take the $18 billion, this was the largest, the fourth largest liquidity injection since, the COVID times as well. And so this really surpasses even what happened during the dot-com bubble in terms of the amount that was injected into the banking system. And we don't even really hear about it. These numbers, these billions of dollars. I remember when like RBS went down and they needed to bail it out for like $23 billion. And it was like the number was so astronomically large. Now we just kind of switch from QT to QE, pump in another $18 billion through the repo markets, and no one even really hears about it. But the point is that America and the dollar has now reached the phase where it must roll over the debt, and it must do it, by protecting bondholders and sacrificing the value of the dollar. And so bondholders are taking preference over maintaining the dollar as the world reserve currency. And that is the Triffin's dilemma. That is the situation you have to look at right now. And then when we've had 2 months where deficits have gone down. I don't think it's going to stay that way. But this, again, as deficits go down, it means that foreign investors have to invest less in the capital account. But the debt needs to be rolled over because the level of interest on the debt is hitting the phase where it is the largest portion of debt after Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. Then you have interest, and then you have defense spending. So it's larger than defense spending. That pretty much makes up, all of the expenditure at the moment. So if foreign buyers are not buying these long-term debts right now, then you have to find a mechanism for selling short-term debt and continually rolling it over and rolling it over and rolling it over. You can't pay it down because that crashes the whole system. And so the Fed must buy short-term debt as the buyer of last resort. And basically, the only way to get that where the interest doesn't bloom, because the interest on the debt is now bigger than the national defense or the Department of War budget, you have to manipulate the rates down. Now, if you're manipulating the short-term rates down, because you can't control the long-term rates are set by bondholders. If bondholders don't like what's happening, they demand a higher interest rate. Now, we have seen the dollar has strengthened a little bit after a ton of weakening, and we've seen the longer-term interest rates come down right now, but that's because the debt is being rolled over all on the short term, and these have to continually be rolled over. It also means that it's, there's less stability in the banking system if there's less long-term debt in there. So who are you going to sell all of these bonds to if foreigners are no longer buying them? And if you're trying to put down the budget deficit, it means you're going to have a capital account, contraction. I don't think they will be able to bring down the deficit because I think it will balloon anyway for reasons that we've said. But the only way to do that is to dump those short-term treasury bills on pensions. And so essentially the pensions are going to have to receive the lower rate. So you're the investor in the case of your pension. And as the rate comes down and it becomes more and more short term, you get lower and lower rates. But remember, the government is rolling over the debt from the zero interest rate environment, after the global financial crisis and then the COVID period. That zero interest rate environment means that even at these rates, at the short-term rate, it's still higher than what was paid when rolling over the zero interest rate debt. So it has to be short-term to get the lower and lower rate, but it still is leading to a ballooning interest payment. What is another mechanism? So getting the Federal Reserve, the rate, short-term rate down, which is regime change at the Fed. The other way to do it is to turn the dollar into programmable money and force through legislation, Clarity Act and Genius Act, that all stable coins must be backed by short-term treasury bills, which is what's happening right now at artificially low rates. And so that's another way of doing it. But the challenge with that is that we've now seen that the demand for these repo loans and putting those bonds, as collateral in order to get these short-term repo loans, it completely dried up. It went from like $3 trillion to about $400 million left. So everybody tried to get as much as they can. The interest on the national debt is going up with every single auction. There were more auctions, but the auctions on the longer term are selling a lot less, which is normal, than the short term because people are not willing to lend to the US government on the short term. On the long term. And so the debt is being rolled over with shorter and shorter term rates while the interest goes up. And those repo, liquidity is drying up. As it dries up, what happens after repo liquidity? Well, the Fed has to step in. And so the Fed starts buying. So it moves from quantitative tightening, where it's sucking up all the dollars, to now being quantitative easing, where it's pushing out more of those dollars as well as a stimulus. And then the Trump administration is reallocating that debt that will be burdened onto the American people into pensions that are going to be paying a lower subsidized rate, and also pushing it into the US stock market. So you're getting this asset price inflation, which is pushing wealth inequality further and further to the asset holders. Now that 92% of all stocks are owned by 10% of institutions and high net worth Americans, with a long tail in the pension side as well. Now, here's the thing. Here is the key thing. This can happen for as long as the growth rate of the US economy outstrips the average interest rate on the debt. Let me repeat that. The growth rate of the US economy, i.e. GDP, that doesn't factor in wealth inequality. You can grow just by focusing on the wealthy only and dumping all the debt on all the average Americans, which are deep in debt. And so your whole policy needs to favor asset price inflation, and anything you can do to roll over the debt and spend it into the stock market so that it makes an artificial GDP, gross domestic product pump. And that's what we mean by fiscal dominance. And so as long as the growth rate beats the average interest rate on the debt, so think about all the debt under the zero interest rate environment. Now you're rolling it over short term at higher and higher interest rates. That's pushing up the average interest rate on the debt. But you can only beat it by the growth rate beating the average interest rate on the debt. That is the key. If that reverses, then we're in trouble. And then you have the problem with the liquidity and the demand to purchase that debt. So remember, the debt has to be rolled over. Now, what I wanted to do in Act 2 is just make sure you understood the rules. And I wanted to play an AI video that I created based upon an analysis by Infranomics, an economist that I follow on YouTube. an analysis on what exactly happened this week with this essential, let's not call it quantitative easing, and whether it signals real distress in the market right now and how long this can go on for. So, Azad, if you could play the first AI summary.
Okay, so a few days ago, 3 gigantic and kind of random looking numbers popped up on the financial world's radar. And they hinted that something really unusual was going on, just beneath the surface. Today, we're going to put on our detective hats, piece these clues together, and solve what is a pretty fascinating financial mystery. So here's our first clue. A massive $30.5 billion was tapped all of a sudden from the Federal Reserve's emergency cash window for banks. And this wasn't just some small little blip on the radar. No, this was the 3rd highest amount pulled since the middle of 2020. You just know banks were scrambling for cash. Clue number 2. On the exact same day, the U.S. government auctioned off a colossal $216 billion in new debt. I mean, that's nearly $250 billion just getting sucked out of the market in a single afternoon. Wild. And now for our last clue, and honestly, this one might be the most surprising of all. While all this other stuff was happening, the Federal Reserve, kind of quietly, printed $8 billion in new money. Just poof. Money that didn't exist a few moments before. So what if we got an emergency loan, a massive government auction, and a secret little money printing operation? I mean, these numbers, they seem totally disconnected, right? Maybe even contradictory. But believe me, they are all threads in a single, incredibly important story about the hidden plumbing of our entire financial system. So let's dive in. Right, we're going to treat this just like a classic mystery. We'll take these clues, piece them all together, and really uncover what was going on deep inside the markets. That very first clue, the $30.5 billion loan, it tells us the most important thing we need to know right off the bat. The system had a sudden, and I mean critical, shortage of cash. Someone, somewhere out there, needed billions of dollars, and they needed it immediately. This points us directly to the scene of the crime. Okay, so to solve this thing, we need to understand the market that basically acts as the financial world's circulatory system. It's the place banks go for these kinds of desperate overnight cash infusions. And that place is the repo market. Honestly, the best way to think about it is as a giant, high-tech pawn shop just for banks. This is the critical plumbing that keeps trillions of dollars flowing smoothly through the system every single day. When it's working, you'd never even know it exists. But when it gets clogged up, everybody notices. And look, this slide just shows you how simple the whole process is. A bank needs cash, so they hand over some super safe U.S. Treasury bonds to the Fed as collateral. The Fed gives them the cash for the night. The next morning, the bank pays it all back with a tiny bit of interest and gets its bonds back. It's a routine transaction that happens trillions of times a year. Okay, so if this is all so routine, why the emergency? What was the big deal? Well, it turns out there wasn't just one culprit. Nope. There were 3 major forces draining cash from the system all at the same time, basically creating a perfect storm. So the first cause was actually a deliberate policy from the Fed itself. It's called quantitative tightening, or QT. For the last couple of years, the Fed's been fighting inflation by shrinking its balance sheet. If quantitative easing is the money printer going brr, QT is the exact opposite. It's like a vacuum, actively sucking dollars out of the financial system. It makes cash just a little bit harder to find, and that's by design. The second cause? The system's emergency reservoir was running on empty. During the pandemic, there was this special Fed facility called the reverse repo. Think of it like a giant storage tank for extra cash. At its peak, it held $2.5 trillion. But that tank has been steadily drained to pay for government spending, and, well, now it's basically empty. The system's main safety buffer is just gone. And the third factor, the final piece of this perfect storm, the U.S. Treasury has been refilling its main checking account. Now, when the government builds up its cash pile, that money doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It effectively pulls hundreds of billions of dollars out of the private banking system and into its own account, which puts even more strain on that already stressed financial plumbing. So why does a clog in some, obscure financial market actually matter to you? Well, it's because a cash shortage here, in this specific market, threatens the very foundation of how the entire United States government funds its operations. To really get the stakes here, you just have to appreciate the sheer scale of this thing. The repo market isn't some small niche corner of finance. We're talking about a $12 trillion behemoth. Its health is absolutely vital to the global economy. And this slide right here, this illustrates the risk perfectly. When the US government needs money and issues new debt, who actually buys it? Just look at that pie chart. A massive 40% slice, the biggest slice of all new US debt, is being bought up by hedge funds using a very specific and pretty risky strategy. That strategy is called the basis trade, and it's an incredibly leveraged bet. We're talking 50 to 100 times leverage. And it depends entirely on borrowing cheap, easy cash from the repo market to buy up enormous amounts of treasury bonds. It's pretty wild, but these hedge funds have become the single biggest buyer of America's debt. And right here, this is the heart of the problem. You see the dominoes? The basis trade just cannot exist without a smoothly functioning repo market. So if the repo market seizes up because there's no cash, the basis trade breaks. And if the single largest buyer of US debt suddenly disappears, who's left to fund the country? It's a huge question. Now for our final clue. With the system basically on the brink, the Fed had to step in and show its hand. So here's how it all played out. In the morning, that huge $216 billion government bond auction acted like a giant vacuum, just sucking all the available cash out of the system. By the afternoon, the system was so dry that banks had no choice but to rush to the Fed's emergency window. And then, by the evening, the Fed saw all the flashing red lights and was forced to act, printing $8 billion just to prevent a full-blown seizure. Now, it is really important to understand this is not the same kind of money printing we saw back in 2020. That was broad quantitative easing, or QE. It was designed to boost the entire economy. This was different. This is called a reserve management purchase, or RMP, and it's more like a surgical strike. It's targeted money printing designed to specifically inject cash right back into that repo market plumbing. So the solution to our whole mystery is this. The Fed had to print money, but it was really just a short-term Band-Aid. It had to make sure that the main buyers of US debt, those highly leveraged hedge funds, had the financing they needed from the repo market. They did it to prevent a potential crisis where a US debt auction could have actually failed. And that's our mystery solved. We saw the critical plumbing get clogged up by a huge government bond auction that threatened the biggest buyers of US debt, which forced the Fed to step in with an emergency injection of brand new, freshly printed cash just to keep the whole system flowing. But this whole story leaves us with a much bigger question, doesn't it? The Federal Reserve proved yet again that it can print money to patch any leak that springs in the system. But, just slapping on Band-Aid after Band-Aid isn't really a long-term solution. It really makes you wonder, with the system relying on such precarious trades and these last-minute fixes, is the entire financial structure due for a major renovation?
Okay, so not only are we turning the dollar into a programmable Orwellian surveillance state through stablecoins in Act 1, in Act 2, the debt rollover strategy of the largest debt that's ever been accumulated in human history, 125% debt to GDP increasing, is effectively hedge fund managers making money by relying upon the Federal Reserve for quantitative easing bailouts. This is the asset stripping mode. This is then the government is then injecting that money into the stock market to print fake GDPs and ensure that the stock market goes up while the dollar's being weakened. And so this really is, Act 2 of the end of the Bretton Woods system when it's relied upon. Now, remember, we still don't know who was on the wrong side of the crazy trade with the silver short squeeze. Remember, they were using paper contracts in order to suppress the price of silver when they wanted the dollar to be the world reserve currency. But when they don't want the financial industrial complex doesn't want the dollar to be the world reserve currency, they let gold rip, they let silver rip, and they accumulate as much Bitcoin by oppressing the price of Bitcoin as possible to build that new negotiation tool. But eventually you end up in a situation where to roll over the debt, you got hedge fund managers that are engaging in ever more degenerate gambling and being bailed out by the Federal Reserve System through the repo markets. And the debt is being rolled over at higher interest rates on shorter and shorter terms. The optics look normal, but the market is severely distressed here. And we still don't know who was on the wrong side of the short trade on silver. Someone got wrecked. Now, was these covert quantitative easing, not quantitative easing strategies, bailout for banks, socializing the losses, privatizing the gains, and then transferring them over to some hedge fund manager where maybe we just don't know who is on the wrong side of that trade, but somebody was on the wrong side of that trade and we still don't know who it is yet. And so anyway, now when you have to roll over the debt and the interest rate is going up, even at the short-term rate, you have to do extreme measures. One is regime change of Federal Reserve, which is what's happening, at the moment. And then you have to figure out, how do you handle the inflation? Because let's be honest, the inflation is somewhat under control in America right now. It's still between that 2 to 3% mark. Now, people are expecting runaway inflation, but we haven't seen it. In fact, inflation's been under control. Now, that doesn't mean that the cost of living is getting better, because inflation is cumulative. Your wages aren't increasing at the same rate. And your wealth is only increasing at a higher rate if you own the assets that's benefiting from the money printing. And so the average American is getting worse and worse and worse, despite the fact that it looking like inflation is under control. But remember, even if inflation, by the numbers that we don't normally believe anyway, is at about that 2.3, 2.4, 2.5%, above the 2% that the goal is to get to. Now, they're not meant to decrease rates until there's some kind of employment shock or that, there's an inflationary resurgence. But inflation seems to be under control. Now, remember, it's cumulative inflation, which means the price that most people couldn't afford, you got 2.5% on top of the price that was unaffordable for most people anyway. And the wages aren't increasing at that rate. And where is most of the tax coming in from? It's not coming from the companies. It's coming from American individual taxpayers. So what did they do? They need to increase tax in order to suppress inflation. Because what is tax? Tax is not needed when you can print money. But when you print money, it creates inflation. And in order to dampen some of that inflation, you take the money out of the circulating supply. And that is by putting it in the TGE, which is the Treasury General Account. The account that the US government, the US Treasury has with the Federal Reserve. The more that goes in there, the more you can dampen inflation. That's one way to control inflation. And so you combat inflation with higher taxes in the debt rollover phase. And so that's what essentially tariffs did. So tariffs brought in approximately $170 billion. But that tariff wasn't to foreign, exporters. It was to small business importers. As I've always said, Dollar Liberation Day was a mechanism by the financial industrial complex to reset the world order into multipolarity and get everyone renegotiating towards China. And that worked. But it was also a tax on small business in America, because the importer pays the tax and the large multinational corporation uses constructs and their proximity to the administration in order to renegotiate those terms so that they don't really pay the tariff. And so 95% of American businesses were paying that import tax. Now, what came out today? Well, the Supreme Court just ruled that Trump's tariff policies are illegal. Now, Trump's coming out and saying that there's a new way around that. And I don't know what's going to happen there. But now, if you've got to reverse that, if the government needs to repay that, then that money goes back into where it was contracting inflation before. And so now it's got to do, if that's how it happens, I'm not sure whether it's going to happen or not. and what the legal implications are, but this is the ruling that the tariffs are illegal. And so we've got to see what exactly happens. So one way of suppressing inflation when you're rolling over the debt is increasing taxes. Tariff was that mechanism. A second way to suppress inflation when you're rolling over the debt in such a radical way is by increasing the productivity of America. Now, how do you increase the productivity? You either increase the productivity of humans, but as you move to more extreme populism, where more and more people are disgruntled and we're getting more and more wealth inequality, you lose productivity, and the productivity is only happening at the highest levels of those that are benefiting from the system. So now, in order to increase productivity, you need to replace humans with something more productive, which is exactly what's happening in artificial intelligence and robotics. And so AI and robotics, by increasing productivity, is a mechanism for suppressing the inflation from the debt rollover. There is a side effect, just as with tariffs. It's a tax on small business, and then it gets reversed, and then you have all hell breaking out as a result of that uncertainty. The second one has a side effect as well. It's great to increase productivity with AI and robotics. Every business would rather not have humans because it gets their costs down and increases their profit margin, but it leads to unemployment, and unemployment means that you're fudging the numbers, but not in a way that really helps. And so we're moving through that transition, which is incredibly disruptive. Now, there is a third way of dampening the inflation when you're rolling over the debt and preventing a hyperinflationary cycle, and that is to lower the price of energy and oil, the input function into all of this artificial intelligence. Now, the problem with this, again, the side effect with doing that is that by lowering the cost, it becomes very problematic for oil producers in America when the Gulf countries can produce and refine at a lot cheaper rate, like Saudi Arabia. And so this has a problem on, the oil companies, which are essentially drill, baby, drill, the Trump voter base. But also, the lower the price of oil, the better it helps China, because China is purchasing oil, and it has a bad impact on Russia, Iran, but it helps China, and so China gets more economic control over the BRICS corridors as well. And so all of this is what's driving the multipolar world. This is, clearly what it is. But those are the only three ways of when you are excessively printing money to oppress some of that inflation. And so far, that's working. But what we're seeing is the price of oil started ticking up this week based upon the Iran news. And so then you start to question yourself, and this is the incredibly difficult situation. People basically need to prepare for that. The only way for you as an individual, where your wages are not going to beat that inflation, and then there are knock-on effects to every tool and mechanism for oppressing that inflation, is you need to hold fixed supply assets, which is why I believe in Act 1, the financial industrial complex have been suppressing the price of Bitcoin to try and get as many people to sell it so that they can have their negotiation tool in transitioning to this multipolar world. And we resist against it through self-custody. And obviously, we've seen the massive commodity boom. And then we've seen the correction now. But long term, you need to be holding fixed supply assets and industrial use assets as well. And so that's Act 2 of the end of the Bretton Woods system, and of the 3 acts of essentially removing the dollar as a world reserve currency. What is the third act? Well, the third act is to remove everything that propped up the dollar, i.e. the deep state. And so by taking on the deep state, you get the narrative. But remember, the deep state propped up the dollar as world reserve currency, because all those wars were mechanisms for leaving the debt on the American people, using covert means in order to create those wars, and then pumping the money back into the US stock market. Now, while those wars were forcing the demand for the dollar, and the value of the dollar was going up relative to gold, silver, and foreign currencies, once you reverse that trade, you have the reverse impact. And so now other countries are selling their treasuries, the dollar's being weakened for bondholders, and you're getting the asset stripping phase that we talked about. So now you need to find ways of spending all of that money. And that's why the deficit won't be taken care of, because it causes problems. And so you have to roll over that debt, and then you have to find justifications for spending that debt into the stock market. Enter the border peace and basically the Middle Eastern forever war endgame that we've been predicting for a long time. Now, I've covered the border peace before, but this week we had the first meeting of Trump's border peace, and we're going to have a little look at it in terms of, are the predictions coming true in terms of this Act 3 of the end of the dollar and the end of the Bretton Woods system? So remember, the IMF was a mechanism through the economic hitmen of forcing the world onto dollar, regime-changing countries, installing dictators, and forcing central banks to print their own local currency so that they can borrow dollars, pay off the dollar debt, and pump up the price of Bitcoin. Pump up the price of dollars for that strengthening. That's the dollar milkshake theory. Everyone ends up using their economy as a collateralized debt obligation, lending it back to the US, and then the US reinvests all of that into the US stock market, and it becomes a self-enforcing loop and a self-licking ice cream. But now that works in reverse when the dollar is weakened and the price of gold and silver and commodities are able to go up. And eventually, with accumulation of all this Bitcoin, you have Bitcoin as the tool, with us holding it in self-custody as a resistance against this centralizing force. And so now we're essentially getting the big covert operations that we know happened in the past and that I've been speculating still happen, which is Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio is where you have proxy armies in all the jurisdictions where you want to steal the resources, destabilize the government, implement sanctions. You know, that's what ISIS, Al-Qaeda, various other things. We got confirmation that in Operation Gladio that these types of operations exist. Read the book by Paul Williams. We also got confirmation in all of the WikiLeaks files that ISIS and Al-Qaeda were utilized for Western interests via Israel and America. We also got confirmation, if you've watched my documentary by Ryan Dawson, Emperor en Masse, on my blog, go to my blog, SimonDixon.com, type in 9/11 and watch the documentary from the FBI investigations of, you know, Mossad's role, Saudi intelligence role, and the CIA's role in covert operations like 9/11. We also got confirmation in the Epstein files that Jeffrey Epstein was communicating around deploying ISIS and Al-Qaeda as tools for propping up Western hegemony. And so by ending in the Middle East, these Operation Gladio operations, you're taking out, and remember, they were funded in the Department of Government Efficiency. Elon Musk revealed on the website that in 2024, I think it was, 695 million went into, via the National Endowment of Democracy and USAID, into ISIS training camps. You know, we got all these confirmations. But it also, we got from previous operations like Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s, that Iran, Israel, and America, factions of power at the top, were working in cahoots with some of these covert operations. And so when you combine the Iran-Contra affair, which is something we factually know happened, where weapons were being trafficked via Israel to Iran, with the fact that we know that these Operation Gladio, stay-at-home, you know, strategic tension operations exist by co-opting governments and higher levels of intelligence, you can guess that that still happens today. And so why have Iran and Israel always been enemies but never really bombed each other unless you get very coordinated operations like the 12-Day War. Because strategic tension was the world order that was set in the Middle East. And that was, I believe, continuations of Iran-Contra affair, Operation Gladio, and these covert mechanisms for ensuring strategic tension always existed to make profits for the military-industrial complex so that you can funnel money through, dump the debt on the American people, use weapons trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking, drugs trafficking, as was revealed in the Epstein files, in order to fund intelligence agencies' black op operations, and then make sure that you have colonies like Israel where you can test all these covert operations, co-option of various factions of power across the Middle East, and then funnel that money back into war expenditure and the $10 trillion that were profiteering by the US stock market, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon, that also propped up and strengthened the dollar and provided this whole money laundering operation. Now, if you end that, which is what I think the border peace is, because the financial industrial complex, as we've always covered, is partnering with transnational capital, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund, China Sovereign Wealth Fund, Singapore Sovereign Wealth Funds, various other funds. Transnational capital is now saying that America will slowly retreat from the Middle East. The deep state in the Middle East will be relocated to Europe, to Latin and Central America, and America becomes a regional power by managing these capital outflows. And so the border peace effectively is a way of doing these different operations. In order to achieve that, you need to resolve very unnatural situations within the Middle East. One of those is Palestine. So now you know how the US empire effectively works. I'm going to play in a bit the border peace. It makes me want to puke listening to it, because you know it's just a PR pitch on something that was 100% manufactured. Everything we've watched that happened in Palestine was a part of this mechanism for propping up the dollar through these covert wars and covert operations. And so we now know categorically, when you watch the border peace video that we're going to be watching shortly, this is exactly how the dollar works. This is exactly what propped up the US empire. This is why the US is in so much debt and where all the value was extracted into this K-shaped economy. And what we saw and what we're seeing in Gaza is not a freak. This is what we've known all along. And this is what's always happened. It happened in the British Empire and it continued into the American Empire. Effectively, the military-industrial complex profits from destruction, ensures that they can have a domination environment by propping up the dollar. And then, once the destruction is done, the financial industrial complex profits from the rebuild. And then you get all the rebuild contracts and the negotiations. The financial industrial complex also profits from funding the war. But now, when you rebuild, the technical industrial complex also profits from more data and more surveillance. And this is all backed by a compromise network, just like we saw with Jeffrey Epstein in sex trafficking and human trafficking operations. And so now we've got the big reveal of everything we've covered over the years in Simon Dixon Hard Talk. And now we've got this everything, everything's a lie. And so we get this press release video where Trump is saying how they're going to usher in the golden age for America by going through these three acts, creating programmable dollar, suppressing the price of Bitcoin to accumulate more of it within the financial industrial complex. And then in Act 2, doing this fiscal dominant strategy where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, rolling over the debt so that the profits are made by the hedge fund managers while the Federal Reserve socializes the losses and privatizes the gains. And then in Act 3, we've got this financial industrial complex operation to weaken the dollar, which means that America needs to look strong while it retreats to being a regional power. And if you watch the border peace video, of course, in true fashion, they're going to say what they've always said. we are the peacemakers. We are exporting democracy and we are civilizing the world because we are a net positive on the world. And so obviously this video will make you want to puke when you understand how things work. But the border peace is effectively framing peace while the financial industrial complex is negotiating that the US exit over time, over the years ahead, and now the world can just get on with the new handover mechanism because China is a rising power and America is being turned into a regional power. And so, Azad, let's play the border peace video that we had to endure this week while America, military industrial complex, effectively said they want to create peace when we know damn well that they profited from all the death, destruction, and all the bombs via their proxy colony, Israel, where they do all the illegal stuff.
The United Nations Security Council approved the establishment of the Board of Peace chaired by President Donald Trump, a governing body dedicated to providing security, infrastructure, and homes for Gaza's people, ushering in the new dawn for Gaza. The new Palestinian Technocratic Government of Gaza, the NCAG, was elected with consent of all parties, including the Palestinian factions, Israel, and the Arab countries. Rafah border crossing with Egypt was open. The NCAG will secure the disarmament of Gaza to ensure one authority, one law, and one weapon. The United States and its partners, in coordination with the World Bank, are pledging billions of dollars to rebuild Gaza. Safe areas are being established in Rafah and later across the Gaza Strip, where families can receive shelter, food, health care, and education. In Rafah, Gazans will build their first new city. The NCAG, with the Board of Peace, will expand development across the entire Strip, employing hundreds of thousands in reconstruction and business activity. Transportation, water, and energy systems will be restored, and a modern economy will begin to emerge. Children will return to classrooms with a curriculum that promotes tolerance, dignity, and peace. Our goal by year 3, Rafah fully rebuilt, unemployment curbed, and Gaza connected to the world through an Abrahamic gateway, linking it with Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and extending to India and Europe. By year 10, Gaza will be self-governed, integrated into the region with thriving industries and housing for all. This is the framework for Gaza's rebirth: secure, prosperous, and peaceful.
Okay, gaslighting at the highest level. But, you know, this is what it is. So there's just a few points that I want everyone to be looking out for in Act 3 of this new world order and a multipolar world order that we're looking out for. The number one thing I noticed that they mentioned there was that the World Bank will be providing some of this funding. But no, the World Bank is just going to provide the bank account. And so it is up to other investors to provide the money. Now, who those investors are is very, very important in terms of how this is going to be structured. So the devil is really in the detail. But of course, the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, in partnering with the financial industrial complex, needed to bribe Donald Trump in order to make this happen. And so Affinity Partners was set up, which has been managed by Jared Kushner, funded by the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds to the tune of billions of dollars. And Trump is all excited about building his Trump Tower in Gaza across the region. And so there were plans for all these different types of hotels and Elon Musk data centers and various other things. And of course, they're going to build these smart cities as a beta test in order to have this technocratic surveillance state. And what did I always say? Whatever they build in Gaza is the beta test for what they want to roll out across the rest of the world. So there you have the vision. So the World Bank's not providing the money. Now that's interesting. That's what we'd like to see, because the World Bank represents Western financial interest, legacy interest. If it is the Gulf countries, then it's staying regional. And so these are the things we need to understand. And of course, you need to pay off some of the Israeli elites, and they will be negotiating exactly what they get from their cut as well, from this as well. They just see this as a financial transaction, business as usual, in this type of structure. They also said that the plan is by year 3, so we got year 3 from once this starts, that the idea is that there will be completely rebuilt, so 3 years to rebuild. Now, from my understanding, there's only one country that could rebuild this within 3 years that has the capacity to do it, which is China. And so whether the infrastructure contracts go to China via some of these Gulf sovereign wealth funds will be something that we'll actually look out in terms of whether that could actually be built in time. Now, they're looking at saying that there's going to be full employment. So all of the Gazans are effectively going to be put to work to rebuild Gaza. We'd have to watch the terms as well around that. But they're saying the goal is to get that done within 3 years. Only China could achieve that. So we'll see whether China's involved in the rebuild as well. Now, well, they also said that so Gaza will be integrated into a new global trade logistics route that is going to be called the Abrahamic Gateway. And so this Abrahamic Gateway is effectively going to link Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE to India and Europe. And so all of this is really the rails around splitting the world into regional blocks: Europe, BRICS, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. That's how they described what they're going to be building there. They also said that by year 10, so a 10-year project, the video claims that Gaza will be entirely self-governed with its own government. They're basically saying it will be featuring thriving industries, is how they frame it. Housing for all citizens. Now, obviously, we've got to understand what happens with the right to return, the ones that stay there at the moment. In the last iteration of the plan, they were talking about tokenizing the real estate as well. So then they could do a pump and dump mechanism depending on the liquidity and how that actually works. And full integration into a broader Middle Eastern region. So that's how they framed it. Now, there are some additional things that would need to be watched as this construct, and all the devil is in the detail in the contracts. Is Palestine going to have its own sovereign wealth fund? Because that's how you build your way out of colonization. What is going to be the ownership structure and the details, and all those details really need to be analyzed. And so this, we don't know yet. These are just the details. So that's Palestine. What is the second thing that needs to be resolved? Well, Israel. And so we started to get announcements that Netanyahu is going to be making Israel independent from the US budget. What that effectively means, if you translate that propaganda into monetary flows, is that the US military industrial complex is going to stop using Israel as a destabilizing force to prop up the dollar, ensure that the region can never actually live in peace. And instead, they're going to have to build their own autonomous industries. Now, obviously, they've got Mossad, they've got technology. But if it's not going to be subsidized by the US military industrial complex over time, that means it is effectively being used to get negotiation for the financial industrial complex. And so the more land that it acquires right now for the financial industrial complex, the more it can play into that negotiation between the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and the banks and financial institutions that are going to have to compensate the military industrial complex to stop destabilizing the region, which is what I think has happened with these negotiations that we've been witnessing. And so expect more basically privatization of Israel industry. We saw that the distress of the 12-day war and various other operations led to acquisitions by the UAE sovereign wealth funds into IAE, Israeli Aerospace Industries, a key node in the military industrial complex. We've also started to see that AI startups have been acquired by Apple. We're starting to see more and more of that. We also started to see routes to create dependencies upon Egypt for natural gas, oil, and various other routes. So all of this implies that the mechanism for getting on with neighbors and not being a destabilizing force for the military industrial complex is happening. And that is being negotiated. The net beneficiaries will be the GCC partnering with the financial industrial complex and paying off the elite Israelis in ushering in this new thing. So I expect Israel at some point this year to be regime changed, blame Netanyahu, and you started to see all the protests where Israel was asking for what happened on October the 7th. We'll have that discussion in part 2. But at some point later this year, you'd expect to see a movement towards the left and then partnership with these new integration routes and a removal of more of the extremist Zionist ideology. Very, very hard mission to achieve. But what did they do? What has happened? Now, I personally believe that the Epstein files are controlled by financial elites, the lobby class, the financial industrial complex. It was a compromised network working with intelligence for military industrial complex operations and blackmail and compromise. And so when they release the Epstein files, they are drawing attention to the ideologies that were previously oppressed. And we're getting this, different mixed messages where people are able to discuss the truth around how Zionism was an ideology, based upon creating radical Jews, a faction of Jews that are more radicalized into operations that then work for military companies. And so you start to get people questioning that ideology. You also saw about 12 days ago, Tucker Carlson, who most people know came from a family of CIA agents. And if you remember his interview with Putin, Putin called him out for saying he applied to be an agent for the CIA. And Tucker Carlson was like, laughing it away. But we started to see Tucker Carlson actually reveal very truthful things about the way that Christians are treated within Israel and Jordan. And if you haven't watched that interview, please go and watch it. You had Christian leaders within Jerusalem that were explaining about how they're treated within Jerusalem, where you have, Jewish Zionists that would be spitting on Christians. And you also had Christian leaders that were explaining that in Jordan, as part of Muslim faith, you have to have religious integration and tolerance. And so all of the Christian community are very safe in Jordan. And I went to Jordan earlier this year, and last year, rather, at the end of last year. That was my exact experience. There was the home of John the Baptist, and that's completely preserved. And you have the peaceful coexistence of Christians and Muslims under Muslim rule in Jordan. Just like in Iran, you have the largest community of Jews outside of Israel, where they're used in order to subscribe to this radical ideology by Operation Gladio and, the strategic tension of funding proxies to create carnage. The Jews in Iran are completely safe. And so that this is the weaponization of religion packed up with covert operations and spread out through media propaganda. So why now are we able to actually see the truth? Well, there is a faction of power that I think comes top down from the financial industrial complex that controls the Epstein files, that is now releasing information that makes it very, very hard for Christian Zionists, where their children are watching what happens with the Epstein files and the connection to Mossad and the degeneracy that comes from these operations. They're now going home to their parents and saying, why do we support Israel? And so you're getting this dismantlement of ideology in order to strategically weaken and turn Israel into a pariah state. You're also getting resistance against that through control of various media outlets, and that's a power struggle. This is a multi-decade operation. And so Tucker Carlson started showing, and I recommend to everybody that they watch those interviews. It's about 12 days ago. And, start to cleanse your mind around the truth and understand how these operations work. So all of this, to me, represents that the financial industrial complex is taking over the faction of power of the military industrial complex in the Middle East. And they're basically killing what, through these covert operations, I guess, would create Muslim Zionism, which is where the Gulf countries had to engage in partnership with the West that led to all of these military bases being built. And so now, if America's going to be replacing and exiting these military covert operations and replacing it with regional stability by financial transactions, you need to kill these ideologies. And so now the Muslim, quote unquote, Zionists are able to actually gain sovereign power and negotiate their structure based upon the power that they actually have. And so this is where we're getting this transition to what is the Abraham Accords handover, where effectively Israel, Palestine, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the financial industrial complex, and the technical industrial complex end up with a new vision for the region based upon financial transactions. And that ends Iran-Contra affair, strategic tension, Operation Gladio, funding of proxies. And so how do you get to that transition? Well, that transition is the third thing that needs to be resolved as part of that, which is the Iran situation right now. And so the goal, I believe, is that within, I've covered this previously, there are factions of power within Iran. You have the IRGC and you have the reformist movements and other factions of power. But the reformists are aligned with China. China normalized with Iran and Saudi Arabia. But there is the old legacy networks of profiteering from strategic tension and weapons trafficking and the various operations as a result of the sanctions that funded black op operations and partnership with Russian mafia and various factions of mafia that exist as a result of not being able to engage in an open economy. And obviously we saw that Scott Bessent destroyed the Iranian currency. We covered those covert operations in order to try and get an Operation Ajax 2.0 to create this uprising. And then that led to the narrative of IRGC pushing back against protesters. And then we had the fog of war PR campaign where they said thousands and thousands of people are being killed. Okay, right. So that's a strategic game. There was Mossad there as well. We got confirmation from both Lindsey Graham and Peter Huckabee that Mossad were on the ground in Iran. So we don't know the truth around those types of stuff. It will come out in the end. But what is the end game? I believe that the tensions that we're witnessing right now is to get to the point where Iran opens up factions of the financial industrial complex by negotiating with key players and in order to have a soft landing through the escalating war that we're about to witness right now. But the fact that it is now escalating to a higher and higher degree implies to me that the negotiations are done. The factions of power have all agreed what happens next, and that includes agreement between China, Russia, the Gulf countries, factions of power within Iran, and obviously the military industrial complex, technical industrial complex, and financial industrial complex, TIC-MIC. And so that will be effectively the Gulf Cooperation Council partnering with BRICS, with the oil flows and the different gas corridors that will be built over the years ahead if this is a successful operation. And what is the goal of this war that's coming up? Now, most people think it's going to go to World War III. I've always said this is executing the managed transition of America looking strong while it shrinks to a regional power based upon the fact that China has normalized and we've got these BRICS and GCC corridors. And so this is I think the end result of what we're about to witness, and it may start either this weekend or in 10 days from now, we may get another Simon Dixon Hard Talk before this escalates, is that we have a weaker Israel, which is economically integrated into the Gulf Cooperation Council and the financial industrial complex. Is going to set the tone for that. You also have the economic vassalization of Iran further into China and BRICS cooperation and corridors, which is what's providing the sanctions relief, and China buying that discounted oil, which is effectively propping up the economy right now, and Russia having those partnerships in terms of ensuring a degree of military protection as well. But the end goal is that I believe the negotiations of the part of Iran that will be opened up to markets, financial industrial complex, and GCC have already been negotiated. And so we either get escalation this weekend, but it looks like it takes a bit longer to get these vast, massive deployments over to the Middle East. So we either get something today, this weekend, but there have also been indications, or the news has been reporting, and the satellite imagery is reporting, that there's been massive US military buildups. And apparently this takes, people that I know say it will take about 10 days to get there. So maybe we've got another 10 days until this fully escalates. But I believe it is now imminent into this managed transition. And during this managed transition, there'll be huge narrative buildup, which is what we've been witnessing right now. You've had on X bases, agents deployed to push propaganda. You've had the whole, how many people are they killing narrative. You had the uprising. You had the currency war. You had, the Maduro operation within Venezuela. Now people speculating what the model looks like. And what I'm expecting is agreed, managed transition where various factions of the IRGC hardliners will be targeted and eliminated, like the 12-day war. Israel will be burdened with additional debt, additional bond rate, insurance premiums, various other things, and more debt burden. Then we'll end up with Iran has already been shedding various proxies in terms of financial support and weapons trafficking. And we're either going to see proxies from all sides integrate or eliminate. This is a bit of a speculation. If it looks like this is turning into a regional war, I believe that it would have been agreed which US bases that are located in certain Gulf countries are meant to be weakened and eliminated in managing this transition. So everything's going to look like we're moving to World War III, and the narrative will be ratcheted up. But I believe the goal is to ratchet up, and then we have a soft landing, and everything would have been agreed, and everybody gets the narrative that they need. But the goal of pushing Iran deeper into BRICS corridors and financial industrial complex corridors, same with Israel, and then the plan that will happen, which is delaying the border peace and the structure, because the investors are not going to invest until they guarantee that there's a level of regional stability, which is what's setting the tone. That right now you're getting the financial institutions insider dealing, just like you got, and I said you would be getting in Syria. And lo and behold, after deals are done for financial industrial complex insiders with Turkey and the GCC, and Israel tries to take more territory to give negotiation leverage to the banks and financial institutions and asset managers, we got an announcement this week that Syria will be US troops will be retreating. We had the Kurds that were guarding the oil, and now we're moving towards more and more sanction relief now that many of the inside deals have been done. And Syria will, I believe, economically integrated into the GCC and the financial industrial complex corridors. And we can expect more and more of that to happen. And that really marks the third act, because what happens when there is peace in the Middle East? Well, now the petrodollar gets weaker. The pegs to the dollar get weaker. More and more integration with China. China has been building rather than regime changing. less American dominance, which means that the military needs to make up for lost profits in Central South America and Europe and box America into a regional hegemon. The operations come home. You get civil unrest, technical industrial complex, Palantir surveillance state, integration into programmable money. Once you have the programmable money, the dollar becomes regional programmable surveillance state. The financial institutions are managing the transition with commodities, accumulating their Bitcoin position. We fight back with self-custody to remain sovereign. We deploy our nodes to make sure that it's not fully centralized. And then it moves into Act 2, fiscal dominance, K-shaped economy. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Asset strip all the assets into global institutions, and then they deploy and manage these transitions by breaking the Japan carry trade, breaking over the rollover mechanism that the hedge funds are rolling over with the Fed right now, and then breaking the euro dollar. And that's exactly what tariff policy, what all of the Trump administration policies has done, which is how I still believe that he works for primarily the financial industrial complex and the technical industrial complex, with the military being compensated, whereas Biden was more military industrial complex. So that is essentially the 3-act play that I wanted to cover in part 1. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to end this by playing an interview that I did in part 2. And really the theme of this interview was sovereignty in a world of manufactured war. I explained the mechanisms for how war is manufactured. We explained the programmability. We explained the fiscal dominance. You have to own assets. And we explained the mechanisms for covert wars and where those wars are likely to go to next based upon my understanding of the capital flows and following the money. And so what does that look like in a world of manufactured war? How do you stay sovereign? How do your companies remain sovereign? And how do your countries remain sovereign? And so I was invited, as I said, by somebody that was born in Israel, said that she was ex-IDF, and she left Israel. She was aligned with the left movement within Israel, recognized the occupation, talked about the immorality of the occupation, and also talks about how she believes October the 7th was an inside job that was allowed to happen as well. And so in the interview, we did an interview where I answered all of her questions initially, and then we started to cover what October the 7th was, and various other things. And so I'm going to now play the interview. I think this one's on me. And in part 2, let me know what you think of the interview. Please do put some comments below. And I'm going to be jumping into the live chat, and I'll be engaging in the live chat while you're watching the interview as well. And let me know what you think of the interview. We cover a lot of topics, and so give me a second while I just share the screen, and make sure that you, while I'm doing that, please do subscribe to this channel. Please do follow me on both Rumble and X, where I give real-time updates. Please do create a free membership on SimonDixon.com. And yes, we get taken out, and I can't stream these videos anymore. We back them up, and we built an infrastructure for backing them up on SimonDixon.com as well. And also make sure you subscribe if you like to download these rather than watch on streaming internet. Then we're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And also I'm on Nostr as well, reposting on Nostr. And I'll be figuring out some more decentralized podcasts as we progress through this as well. So do me a favor. I'm just going to pull up the interview and video right now. I just got to reload it to make sure it doesn't buffer. But while I'm doing that, please add some comments. I'll mute myself, and then we'll go straight into the video. And that's going to be everything for this week's Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. So give me a second and I'll play that video. He asked me, like, son, I've got no idea. Where is my money? Like, where is it? What happened to it? And that kind of defined the rest of my life. And 26 years later, I'm still trying to help people answer that question. In order to progress as a market maker, you need to engage in degeneracy. You need to be out in the drug scene in order to build relationships with the clients that you need in order to get to the next stage. They pay these education system to teach you the shit that poisons our food, turns doctors into drug dealers, and turns economists into debt dealers. It's just a money laundering organization. And the only people that get published are the ones that are attached to a financial agenda. So the whole system's wrapped up in an illusion of democracy, an illusion that your vote matters. It's a pay-to-play system. And the higher you get, the more compromised you have to be. That's what the Jeffrey Epstein files were. People think like Israel rules the world. Now, Israel is subordinate to its own corrupt power structure, just like America is, just like UK is, just like the rest of the West is. And the military industrial complex has these blackmail operations and various other things. People think it's like Jeffrey Epstein is like a one-off. There's thousands of Jeffrey Epsteins. There's thousands of them. All of those wars in the Middle East made someone trillions of dollars. The debt is the American person. The value is in the US stock market. And there are a bunch of corruption in the middle that all got their cut for being useful to power. And so Netanyahu doesn't work for the Israeli people. I don't think he fixed the world. I don't think Bitcoin fixed the world. But I think it gives you an option to exit. And I think it gives you an option to boycott. And I think it gives you an option to take that energy and channel your money into something that is better.
Hello and welcome to another episode of You're the Voice. I'm Efrat from Bali this time, and I have the honor and pleasure of being here with someone I highly appreciate and follow for the past few years, Simon Dixon. Hello, Simon. Thanks for being with me.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to seeing where we take this one. There's so many directions we could take this, so I'll leave you to direct this.
Yes, there are so many directions, and when I told some of my close friends that I'm having you on, they were like so excited. They said, oh, it's the day, today's the day. This is great, because they definitely see the potential intersections that we can have in the stuff that we're doing. And so for my audience that may not know you, and there may be some that don't know you, because not everyone in my audience are coming from like Bitcoin background or geopolitics. So just a quick intro, if I may. Simon is a Bitcoin investor, entrepreneur, geopolitical analyst, and financial expert who moved from traditional finance into Bitcoin after questioning how the system works and following the dot-com crash. He's a Bitcoin OG, has been around since the beginning, and authored the book Bank to the Future. And he invested in many leading crypto and fintech companies at the time. And today he focuses on Bitcoin education, self-custody, and geo-financial analysis, helping people understand the world from the lens of follow the money, which helps people understand the forces shaping our world. And I've been a fan for a long time. And could you share your backstory a little bit, like especially your dad's influence and what became your life's mission and purpose out of that?
Yeah, sure. So for me, my journey in money, which has become a borderline obsessive, unhealthy, very crazy obsession over understanding everything about money. And I don't mean, just the accumulation of money, like that's a part of it, but just actually understanding the essence of the spiritual side of money and the structural side and the effect it has on human behaviors. It started for me 25 years ago. Wow, we're 2026, so 26 years ago now. And it was during the dot-com boom and bust. I was brought up by my father. My mother left at a young age for me. And he was born in the 1933, so during the start of the Great Depression that led into World War II. And, he was in a town called Bristol in UK, which was being bombed. He came from poverty. He was the seventh son of the seventh son. And he had, one sister and five brothers. And they were brought up on a bus driver salary, which I just thought was interesting. Although they lived in poverty and they were surrounded by war and in a Great Depression, it was still possible for a bus driver to look after their family and still have, his wife look after the children. So, he came from that extreme, I guess you'd say. You can imagine the psychological impact of living through a Great Depression and going through a world war. And throughout his whole life, he kind of had a chip on his shoulder to make it. And he had a very colorful life, whether it be from gambling to trying to make it in the London scene. He was flatmates with Jimi Hendrix and all sorts of stuff. But, through wheeling and dealing and hustling, going to prison, coming out of prison. He became a self-made millionaire. And for him to hit that $1 million mark, pound mark, was an unbelievable achievement for him. But once he had made it, he hit that retirement age, and I was about 18 at the time. And he decided that his kind of gambling type of mentality went into the stock market. And so he opened a brokerage account and opened an account with a company called TD Waterhouse. Sorry, so much detail here, but I'll carry on and get it faster. And he put all of his money in, and he made a lot of money because it was leading up to the dot-com boom. And then the bust happened and he lost everything. And I remember him having such an amateur understanding of the markets, but because he made so much money, kind of reminds us of crypto people. In a bull market, he just got further and further and further into gambling it all, until eventually he didn't really know much about markets, but he logged into his account and there was virtually nothing left. And I remember it was imagine how he felt his whole life, from nothing to millionaire to nothing again at retirement age. So he asked me, like, son, I've got no idea. Where is my money? Like, where is it? What happened to it? And that kind of defined the rest of my life. And 26 years later, I'm still trying to help people answer that question. And so my first part of the journey was, well, where do you learn about money? And my father always wanted me to be in business and real estate and stuff like that. But for some reason, the answer that I was indoctrinated into how do you learn about money is to go to university. So I went to university and studied economics, and I didn't get the answer. So I thought I'd give it another try. So I did a master's and didn't get the answer. And then I said, well, what am I going to do? I got to get a job in the city. Now, it was really interesting. The firm, I went to Manchester University to do my master's in North England. And the firm that my father opened his brokerage account, TD Waterhouse, happened to be located in Manchester. So I knocked on the door and managed to just get myself a job as a T-boy in the stock brokerage firm that he lost all his money in. And I was like, okay, now I'm going to figure out what happened to his account and where it all went. And but I managed to get a job as after I got promoted to being a stockbroker. And then once I was a stockbroker, I learned that, okay, money is about selling stocks. And often what you're selling is just narrative and story. And so then I was like, but I want to know how these stocks actually move. And so as I was a stockbroker, I built a relationship with the market makers in the London Stock Exchange that were moving the markets and making prices. And I managed to get myself a job as a market maker. And so then I learned that the whole thing is market manipulation. And you have these traders, which are called sales traders, and their job is to fulfill orders. And often when you're basically, they call it market making, finding prices. But half the time we had a whole book of stocks that were naked short, and we couldn't cover them. And so, that's illegal. But it was still a standard practice. And, I would learn that when you push stories out in the media, it's often to fulfill an order from a large institutional trader like Goldman Sachs that's trying to sell while they make a buy recommendation and so I just learned firsthand that the normal person is always on the wrong side of the insiders.
This is very similar to the relationship between the pharma companies and the media company. They have this relationship where they pay them so much money for advertisement, and they're lobbying as well. And so they have so much power in dictating what the narrative would be in the media. So they can, sell a defected product, a genetic experiment to the public, and kind of, do a worldwide experiment on everyone just because of that power they have. And it's very similar to how they scam us with money in the financial markets. It's the same system.
Ever find yourself needing cash but refusing to sell your Bitcoin? That's real life for many Bitcoin. Enabling beginners.
Foundation of you need to
and using the code Efrat.
Soul. And realizing that in order to progress as a market maker, you need to engage in degeneracy. You need to be out in the drug scene. You need to kind of, I just realized that in order to grow, you're eventually going to be engaging in prostitution and all sorts of degeneracy in order to build relationships with the clients that you need in order to get to the next stage. And so I kind of learned about that, Wolf of Wall Street kind of cartoon character. But it's true. And so, I kind of learned about this whole, to grow in that scene. There is layers of what I think we're discovering now. And I didn't see it to the full extent, but I saw the foundation of a compromise network that you have to kind of mutually compromise to grow as you rise to power in these corporate investment banking structures. So I decided that I then was like, well, this is soul destroying. Maybe I should change into understanding how these companies got on the stock market in the first place. So I did my final job in corporate finance. And that was just helping venture capitalists exit their portfolios by taking the companies public. And I kind of was at a smaller investment bank. It was a Danish investment bank, a Dutch investment bank, no, Danish, sorry, KBC. And I started to learn that war is actually a business plan. And when you pitch certain companies that are going public, I kind of saw the inside track in what is being negotiated in a lot of these war zones right now. That to stop a war, you have to make more profit from peace. And that's actually just an algorithm and an equation. And there is a very defined process around this. And so
destruction.
This was kind of my first introduction to the level of detachment from the human spirit that happens within these financial transactions and securitization and financialization process. And until you can come up with, a 10x business plan, then there's more profit from war and various other things. But also just learning, the whole process of securitization and financialization and how a business effectively becomes a product. It starts as something that a founder has a lot of soul in. And slowly you remove all that, replace it with a governance structure. And then once you're at the public stage, kind of regulations and governance takes over what the business was. And then it becomes a tool for selling shares and raising debt and becoming subordinate to a greater financial power that relies upon you working for your share price. And so I kind of understood all those incentive games. And again, I went through my moment. I hope you don't mind doing this level of detail because I think
I love this level of detail, but I'm pausing you for a second just to give you a thought that came as you were sharing this beautifully. I come from tech, 25 years in tech and marketing. And isn't it ironic that, one of your first jobs was like market making? I want to use that term because one of the things that companies or entities need in order to grow and survive is a market. They need a demand from the market. And if they have the product, if they're already in the stage where they have the product, but the market is not ready for them, or the market doesn't have enough demand to justify their growth, they will create the market. They will create the demand. And so, I'm looking at the parallels where I come from in Israel. I've been seeing the market making of war for decades. When there is a relative peace and quiet, they'll create the next thing, the next operation, the next war, the next thing. They just constantly create demand for war. And then the sad thing is that the propagandized people that don't see what is actually happening and what kind of machine is working behind the scenes to create that demand, they then cheer for the arms and weaponry industry that is getting stronger and better as a result of that war or project or operation or whatever is happening. It's like, oh, great, we have demand again for those companies that are coming out of Israel and that the world now needs our weapons or whatever. And it's not the biggest sector in Israel, but it's one of the, in export I'm talking about, it, and also local demand, but it's one of the biggest. And it's insane that it's like a self-feeding loop. We create but we kill and destroy in the process. And when you're talking about your soul being like diminished during those years, that's exactly the process that I felt that I'm going through, or that many people in Israel or in other, obviously in other countries around us are experiencing, that your soul is being corrupted and manipulated so many times to buy this story, the narrative, the self-fulfilling prophecy, that at one point you either become completely numb and zombified to it, which is the state of most people where I come from, or you're like, okay, I'm leaving, I'm opting out. This is ridiculous, which is where I am. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to share that thought with you.
Yeah, I think it's important because it's an interesting conversation for us because of my activism work against Israel at the moment. And then obviously you've got the direct experience. And we were talking before this that at some stage these conversations need to happen and the human side needs to come in. So let's carry on. Yeah. So that was the entirety of my corporate career. I hit the stage where I just threw in the corporate towel, and it was 2006. So in stockbroking, I learned that everything's about sales with no ethics. In market making, I learned that markets are completely rigged. And in corporate finance, I learned that war is a racket, and securitization and financialization is the process of taking out the soul and replacing it with a power structure that means you're subordinate to your investment bank and your financier. All of that kind of tied into my overarching philosophy of understanding how the stock market works and what drives markets. So I decided I couldn't handle any more of that, and I decided to quit my job, and I wanted to give lectures on money. And in order to teach people how the monetary system worked, I didn't get my answers in university, and I didn't get my full answers in working as an insider in the investment banking. So I obsessively started, I kind of started with a conspiracy theory type of route where I was trying to understand fractional reserve banking. And at those times, it was like, if you would tell people how money's created, you would be called a conspiracy theorist. And so I watched documentaries like The Money Masters by Bill Steele and various others. I read a book by Michael Raubotham called The Grip of Death. And it started to teach me how the IMF works, how fractional reserve banking works, and how inherently fiat currency is a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so I decided to, where there isn't actually enough interest in order to pay the debt, so you have to roll over the debt in a perpetual cycle. And that creates these cycles that begins and ends empires. And so I really started to try and understand the structures and the institutional side of this. And I got invited. I think I presented approximately. I started with the colleges and the universities, and I was kind of helping the next generation that wanted to be financiers. And I would always end up teaching them how money worked. And there were certain institutions that would be very upset with my message. So I presented at London School of Economics. They were really angry at me for teaching how money actually works. University College of London, they were really angry at me. Birkbeck University, Chicago, when I went and presented there as well.
Was it a guest lecture, or you were a professor?
I wasn't a professor, no. I was just giving lectures mainly around the guises of people careers and stuff like that. But I would always put in my passion of explaining how monetary reform works. And so at that time, we joined some not-for-profits, and one of them that was in the UK was created from. So we built this whole teaching people how money works and how banking works, and we were always focused on the universities. And from that, a not-for-profit called Positive Money came, which was basically educating people on how to reform money. This is actually really interesting because the person that worked for my company at the time, he went and created a not-for-profit called Positive Money. And we ended up in very different directions. The first conference had myself, Richard Werner, and a guy called Ben Dyson. And I'll come back to this later. But at some point, I went down the Bitcoin route. Richard Werner started saying Bitcoin's a scam and it was created by the CIA. And he ended up in the quantitative easing route. And he worked for the Bank of Japan and various other things. And Ben Dyson ended up going down the digital money route and ended up working for the Bank of England in their central bank digital currency initiative, and then left to work for the Bank for International Settlements to create their Enbridge, central bank digital currency payment route. So three of us kind of went in very different directions, and it all came from those early monetary reform conversations. But in UK, the monetary reform community before Bitcoin was basically a bunch of pensioners that were trying to figure out how do we return to a gold standard. And the conversations were just, the average person was age 60 to 70. And we used to meet every year in this place called Bromsgrove in Birmingham. And nothing would ever happen. People would write books explaining how money would work. And I was a young whippersnapper that was trying to say, right, how do we change the world? Very ignorant at the time. And so I said, well, look, let's engage in politics. So I was invited to House of Lords. I was invited to Parliament at this time. And the financial crisis happened, started 2007, 2008. And suddenly, a few people in a room turned to hundreds of people in the room. And then they were doing inquiries into what happened during the financial crisis. And so I was invited to come and speak at these types of events. And I thought all I needed to do was get politicians to understand how this system works, and then they change it. Then I realized that actually the sponsors of the inquiry was the banks. And so Sir John Vickers, who was a banker and a sir and a lord, was the person that was inquiring the banks, and yet he was sponsored by the banks. And so I kind of learned that, governments don't work for the people, they work for their lobbies. And so, I discovered that I'm trying to persuade the government to change the banks, and they are effectively bought by the banks. And so I learned the utter hopelessness that you can't change. There's no political solution because the people that control the government are the same people that benefit from this system. And so that was a realization. So now we've done university, we've done every career I could get. Then we realized politics doesn't have a solution. So then I was like, okay, what about entrepreneurship? Maybe that's the answer. My father brought me up to be an entrepreneur. How did I end up in academic? How did I end up in in a job? So I kind of tried to go back to my route. And so my wife was working in commercial banking. I was working in investment banking and had left. And we decided, why don't we create a bank? And so we thought that would be a good idea. And so we said, right, I've got an idea. Let's just show the government what a non-fractional reserve bank looks like. And so we were like, okay, sure. So we pulled together all of our last savings, and we decided to create a bank. And so this is when we formed a company called Bank to the Future. It was in the UK, and we said, right, what do we need? Well, we need a team of people that have created a bank. And so we recruited some of the people that worked for a bank called Metro Bank. And the reason we recruited them is because in the last 100 years, prior to this whole technical stuff, only one bank had been approved to get a banking license, and it was to have direct clearing into the Bank of England. There was only 4 banks, and a 5th bank was added, and that was Metro Bank. And so we managed to actually recruit the team that applied for the license and made it all happen. And I was thinking, okay, all you need is the team that know how to do it. Then you'll get the license. And so what I shortly realized is that no, I wasn't in the right circles. And the reason they got a license is because they came from a family of elites and they agreed to submit to how the system works. I wasn't in that club. And so I put together the best team we could, and we got the meeting in order with the regulators to find out what we needed to do to get this banking license. And so one of the first things that happened is myself and my wife came in, and they looked at my wife, and I'll never forget this. They said, "You're not the type of person that we would normally regulate." And so immediately that was like, okay. And we presented our business plan. And the long and short of it is they said, well, to continue this application, we're going to need 60 million at the Bank of England in a Bank of England account. And you're going to have to get an agreement with a bank to build on top of their bank. And so I was like, yeah, but we want full reserves. We want, we don't want to rehypothecate. We just want to create a safe storage for people's money. We want them to direct the flow of their money. We want to charge a fee for offering that. And we don't want to rehypothecate. We don't want to make money, through debt. And they said, yeah, fine, you can do that, but you have to put the money at Barclays Bank and build on their technology, and they rehypothecate for you. So I was like, okay, so what you're saying is that we get the problems with full reserve, but we're still fractional reserve. And they said, yes, of course. And so it turned out that even if you want full reserve and you want to have people custody their money, it's actually impossible. You have to build on top of a fractional reserve bank. You have to have 60 million to start the process. And there are a type of people that they give license to. And we weren't in that club. So I thought, okay, so you can't create a non-fractional reserve bank through entrepreneurship. Maybe you can do it through technology. And so at this time, there was a movement of fintech companies. And one of the companies was called Zopa, and it was a peer-to-peer lending platform. Started in 2006, and basically you could people could pull their money and then you could lend it, and that was kind of the mechanism. But then they had to have the money at a bank, and then therefore it would be engaging in fraction. So what I realized is there's no exit. Like whatever technology you come up with, and you still are built upon this system, and there is no way of exiting that system. So that cost me everything, and we went deep in debt. And I decided to write a book, and that was Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. And I was explaining what needs to happen to change this system. And that brought me in the sphere of digital currencies and various other things. And again, this isn't a short story, but I hope this is okay. Like going down this route.
Of course, go on.
So the next phase was as I was writing the book, I got a message. This is 2010 at this stage. I got a message from a guy that was part of the monetary reform community, and his name was Johnny Bitcoin. And Johnny Bitcoin messaged me and said, "Hey, Simon, I've decided I'm not going to be involved in any of that stuff anymore. But I've moved out of my house. I've sold my house, and I've moved into a squat on Old Street with these people that are working on the code of something called Bitcoin. It's the future of money. Why don't you come and check it out?" And so this is when I met some of the very early Bitcoin developers, like Amir Taki and various other people. and they were in a squat in Old Street. And I included Bitcoin in the book and started looking at all these different aspects of how Bitcoin works. And Amir Toki was running a conference in Prague in 2011, and he invited me to speak. And there was like Max Kaiser there and various other people. And I was watching the price of Bitcoin at this stage. It went at the time of the conference, it went from $30 to $3. So we had a 90% correction and crash. And then just met the Bitcoin community. And then because I was writing the book, I wasn't skeptical about Bitcoin because I was looking for an exit to build a bank. And so I was very receptive to how it worked because I realized this is actually an exit.
Yeah.
And so that was my first introduction to Bitcoin. My wife, we didn't have enough money because we were just deep in debt at this stage. We were about, it was a massive amount for me at the time, but we were about, £250,000 in the hole, just trying to get this business plan moving. Neither of us had a job. And she said, let's take our last bit of credit card debt and go to this conference in Prague. And it turned out to be a really good decision.
Wow, your wife is super cool.
Yeah. And so, that was bought the first Bitcoin at $3, but understood the structure. And that was when really the thesis came out. It was that this is money you can own. It's a self-custody.
Yeah.
This is money you can spend without permission.
Yeah.
So peer-to-peer. And there's actually a monetary policy attached to this, which is there's a fixed supply. And so realize that, okay, this is where we should spend all of our time and attention. And that was my first introduction to Bitcoin. And then at the conference, there was a guy called Tony Galippi pitching a company called BitPay. And Max Kaiser and myself ended up investing in it because the price of Bitcoin went up. And we decided, well, let's make this more usable for people. And so there were all these companies. And later, Max and myself created the first Bitcoin venture capital fund called Bitcoin Capital. And then we went through this whole journey all over again in Bitcoin. So we pivoted Bank to the Future, realized you can't create a bank. So why don't we create a securities business? And basically we ended up at Bank to the Future, we ended up kind of creating, as crazy as it sounds right now, but in retrospect, I understand what we created. We created like the BlackRock of Bitcoin companies. Which is that we were pooling together our money and everyone else's money in the Bitcoin community and then investing in these Bitcoin companies.
Yeah.
But we would structure it as a special company in Cayman Island, an SPV. And then we would end up with the voting rights. And so we'd end up having influence over these companies because no venture capitalist was interested. There was no one in our industry at the time. And so, we ended up realizing, okay, so through these structures, you end up influential over the company to a certain degree, depending on the more you invest. We were investing our money and you pull together other people's money. And later we ended up investing in over 100 companies in the industry, from Coinbase, Kraken, Bitstamp, Bitfinex, BitPayzer to help Bitcoin payments in Africa, Bitso to help Bitcoin payments in Mexico, AirTM to help Bitcoin payments in Venezuela and Argentina, UnoCoin to help Bitcoin transactions in India, and just trying to help all these different parts of the ecosystem set up. And they all started as Bitcoin companies and then ended up as shitcoin companies. And the ones that succeeded to the highest degree ended up effectively, on the market, like Coinbase. It ended up going public at like 100 billion valuation. But once you're there, you become just a tool for the banks because you have to be subordinate to the banks, and you end up becoming a bank. And so I saw the whole ethos of how the financialization and securitization just drives you into propping up the existing system. And through regulation and compliance, the mission kind of went from let's help a bunch of Bitcoin companies to, all right, now we need to do AML, KYC on suspicious activity reports and Bank Secrecy Act. And from just trying to help Bitcoin companies raise finance and be a securities business, you realize that you're just captured into the system.
Yeah.
And so 90% of my time ended up on surveillance, AML compliance, suspicious activity reports, preventing money laundering. And if I got it wrong as an executive, you go to prison. And so you realize that, and you have to, you're not allowed to be transparent about these, so I saw how the system's just so captured that the second you create a centralized company, you then need to answer to investors, and then you need to get a license. And once you get a license, you're in the system and you can't exit the system. And so that was my experience. Eventually, after raising finance for all these companies, Coinbase became so big that we ended up selling our company to Coinbase, but keeping much of the assets and became just an asset manager. But we didn't want to raise finance for because any more companies, because I saw everything. We ended up investing in companies that became scams, companies like Celsius that I think were deeply connected to intelligence ops, and saw everything you could possibly imagine just by investing in a portfolio of 100 companies and running a regulated company. So yeah,
So
anyway.
Today you don't invest in any Bitcoin company? You're not an investor?
At the moment, I've hit the stage where I want to cleanse myself of all companies because I saw so much and got burnt by so many people and saw the corruption that happens in order to grow in this sector as a centralized company. I learned that you start as your original mission and you end up subordinate to what I call a financial industrial complex. And I saw how Silicon Valley were tools of control, and the public markets and the debt capital markets are tools for leverage and subordination. And I kind of learned how systemically and architecturally, in order to succeed as a centralized company, you become a cog in a wheel and part of the machine. And so, I decided that I would divest myself from as many of these companies, and that's kind of like where I am at this stage.
Do you think? I mean, you recently had a conversation with like Jeff from EgoDev, for example. Do you think that some of the Bitcoin companies that exist today, they are also in this swamp, or they have a level of freedom, relative freedom, because their investors are Bitcoiners as well?
Look, if you succeed as a centralized company, you will eventually be Tether. You will have to deal, the more you succeed, you will have to deal with investment banks. You will have to subordinate to banks in order to get your fiat on ramps and off ramps. You will have to subordinate to regulators that will turn you into surveillance machines. You will also, if you want to rise in getting access to the real capital, you'll be involved in blackmail operations and degeneracy operations and compromise operations. Eventually, they'll put transactions through your platform that means that you either end up in prison or you become a tool for power. And that's the reality of how it works. And so if you're running a financial, or you'll stay decentralized and you'll end up in, either you manage to do it as Satoshi did it, or you'll end up in the same place that the Samurai Wallet people ended up. And so it is a very chilling effect. And if you want to work with government, I did the whole government thing. So we put together a Bitcoin bond backed by Bitcoin mining in Iceland in 2014. We tried to give a Bitcoin strategic reserve and legal tender strategy to the UK, and ended up getting booted out of the country. Ended up having, being targeted by the political elite in order to shut down our company. I had to leave the country. Ended up moving to Hong Kong and reincorporating in different jurisdictions to survive. Tried to do the same on the Isle of Man. I got the whole government to make Bitcoin legal tender. The Bank of England contacted the government and said, "We're going to remove clearing to your island if you do this." So I realized the Bank of England is, a higher up of the structure, the power structure. I just started to develop an understanding of how real power works. Tried to support Bukele in the Bitcoin bond. I don't really tell my story, but got myself on the wrong side of IMF economic hitmen and understand that there are real powers, real powers. And you understand how these mafia networks work. Yeah. And so you may be allowed to do a Bitcoin strategic reserve, but you have to negotiate with a mafia in order to be able to do that. And there is a whole hierarchy, So all my experiences with doing that for government made me realize that, countries have choices. They either go down the Venezuela route and look what happens there, or you go down the subordination to greater power route, IMF, technical industrial complex, financial industrial complex, and you might be able to achieve something like Bukele achieved. But the ultimate power structure is still there. And until you build sovereign wealth for you as an individual. Now, here's the beauty. Bank to the Future never needed Silicon Valley money because we put Bitcoin on our balance sheet from the beginning. And we managed our money where the gains in Bitcoin meant we could avoid raising finance. And we had a small group of ideologically aligned investors. But there were attempts to try and get us into that Silicon Valley infrastructure, and we didn't need it. We didn't do it. We decided to grow organically using Bitcoin on the balance sheet, and we maintained independence until the whole regulatory side kicked in.
Okay, so stop there for a second. So this is a way. I'm looking for a ray of light, for hope, for the Bitcoin startup ecosystem. for them to continue to bloom. Is there a way? Are you saying that is maybe the way? Maybe if they hold Bitcoin on their reserves and then they bootstrap and they don't have to have dependency on VC money, etc.
So you got to deal with the regulations. You got to deal with the banking. You got to deal with the funding.
Yes.
You got to be in a jurisdiction where you get a degree of autonomy as an individual, in a jurisdiction where your corporate structure has a degree of autonomy, and then you got to hedge with multiple jurisdictions.
Yeah.
That's hard. That's very hard.
It's a complex game.
Yeah. And I've seen 100 different companies go through that, and I went through that. And eventually you need to play jurisdictional arbitrage. And if you're going to use a corporate structure, then we avoided going public. We ended up selling our company to those that were going to go public. We maintained the assets, and we set up a structure whereby effectively, without doing business, we could just manage those assets, and the operating business was taken away, in order to do that. But Bitcoin on the balance sheet was what kept us independent and sovereign. And so me as an individual, I became sovereign because of Bitcoin. The company remained sovereign because of Bitcoin. But if you do the whole Bitcoin treasury company, you're a bitch of Wall Street. You're raising equity capital from the investment banks. You're raising debt finance from...
that's a different game. That's the distinction. Yeah, that's very different.
And you're buying Bitcoin, which means you're playing the game of centralizing Bitcoin for power. And centralizing Bitcoin for power is an attack vector on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And so there's a reason why Wall Street wanted to create as many Bitcoin treasury companies, and nodes like Cantor Fitzgerald were deployed in order to do that. And we're seeing Cantor Fitzgerald, connected to Howard Lutnick, and he's someone that's under fire right now because of his connections to compromised networks like Jeffrey Epstein.
Of course.
Okay.
And wait. We're going to get to Bitcoin more because I have other stuff that I want to ask you about, and I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, fuck, I only have like an hour left with you. So I want to take you to a few other directions, and then we'll get back to Bitcoin later because it's so natural for us to just get there. Okay, so how do you see it? You always say that you don't think there's a cabal, but a complex web of relationships, incentive structures, etc. And you talk in your work about the military-industrial complex, the financial-industrial complex, and the technological-industrial complex. I highly recommend people who haven't heard, this is the first time you're hearing those terms, to go to Simon's YouTube and just watch any one of his videos. He's explaining that. I don't know if we have time to go deep into it, but you can maybe give like a high-level overview on what that is. But do you think that many world leaders, like I'm calling them world leaders, are coordinating deals and dependencies behind the scenes and presenting one narrative publicly, while as they do that, the real multipolar world order is shaped quietly behind the scenes, like through these relationships? So is that how you see things, basically?
Yeah, so I just kind of described how subordination works at the corporate structure. The same thing happens at the government structure. So governments need funding. They have a few mechanisms for funding. They can print money, which makes you subordinate to the central bank, which has its own hierarchy. Most central banks are members of the Bank for International Settlement. The Bank for International Settlement is its own country, jurisdiction, army, and police force, located in Switzerland.
Basel.
And which has a global structure of coordinating global fiat currencies. And so you have a central banking structure and money printing at the banks. So the banks get to create your currency every time they issue a loan. So you have subordination to a central banking structure, depending on how you structure your central bank, and the banks that create your fiat currency through fractional reserve banking. Those are two leverage points. You then also have bonds. So you can sell government debt to the people, but that makes you subordinate to an investment banking structure. So now you've got an investment bank, a commercial bank, a central bank, and then who ends up buying your bonds? Well, they end up normally massive, large pools of capital like pension, endowments, which makes you subordinate to the asset managers. Who are the largest asset managers? That's BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. So now you're in the Western financial industrial complex and sovereign wealth funds. And so, and whoever ends up buying your, wealthy, rich individuals within your own oligarchy within your country. And so within your own oligarchy within a country, you tend to have the underworld, the shadowy world. You have the rich oligarchs, and they end up buying your bonds in order to influence power. And so then they have an overarching structure. So overarching, your country works for your bondholders, your investment banks, your commercial banks, and your central banks. Then you have a mechanism for funding Congress, Senate, judicial, whatever it may be. That normally comes from lobbies. And lobbies have terms and conditions. They don't just give money because they're trying to support their country or they want favors. And so every politician is funded by a lobby, and those lobbies say, here's your goal, I'll give you some money, and if you achieve your milestones, I'll give you more money. And so all politicians become prostitutes for this power structure. Then you need other factions of power. So you got the money. What else is powerful? Well, you have energy. If you're blessed with energy, if it's oil or resources or gold or whatever it may be on your land, then you either get on the wrong side of a foreign military, which regime changes you to get access to your resources, bombs you and blows you up to gain access to your resources, destroys your currency to gain access to your resources, installs a dictator to gain access to your resources, funds a covert militia group to destroy your country in order to get access to your resources, or you are able to negotiate with this power structure by keeping your resources and putting it in a sovereign wealth fund and partnering with this financial industrial complex. So if by some miracle you don't get assassinated, killed, regime changed, destroyed, currency warred, if you play the game well enough, then the best you get is to keep your resources, put it in a sovereign wealth fund, and partner with the financial industrial complex, where the transactions you do together means that they don't kill you. And by kill you, I mean the empire, this central banking empire that is able to use its financial weapons of mass destruction to subordinate every company that goes public, every company that raises Silicon Valley financing and compromises up the network. And so then you have resources and choke points. And people want to steal your resources and your choke points. Why? Because they want to take your assets, use fiat currency to gain access to the power to take those assets, and then store it at gold at a central bank. So all they wanted was hard money in the end. But they use your resources and fiat currency to steal your hard money. But everyone's in a game of monopoly to try and end up with all the gold in their central bank. And you have sovereign wealth and debt and capital markets to try and steal it. It is kind of the game. So some of that money goes into a military industrial complex. And that military industrial complex is pitched as acting in the country's national, defense. But it's actually co-opted by corporate power. And so if you want some oil, Chevron and Exxon and the lobbies can say, hey, Senate, Congress, and blackmail via the deep state for judicial, go get me some Venezuelan oil. And the military industrial complex is deployed. Now, military industrial complex is a racket in itself because the US stock market in the post-Bretton Woods world order was propped up by this military industrial complex. And so if you've got a debt-based Ponzi scheme where the government is subordinate to bondholders, and bondholders are funding both sides of an ideological war, let's call it capitalism and communism, then you can burden all the people with the debt. We've got $38 trillion of debt right now. And you can control where it goes, Pentagon budget, lobby, and push it into the US stock market to help Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon. And you can structure it through financialization and securitization, which helps JP Morgan, Citibank, Bank of America. And then you can take all the people's money that you're pooling together through fund management. And it helps BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard manage all this portfolio, get 20,000 board seats on every single public company. And how does a corporate structure work? You have an executive team. These are the entrepreneurs that you think rule the show. They work for the board. The board is there to protect the shareholders and there for shareholders. And the board works for the shareholders. So it's the shareholder class that rule. And a company like BlackRock and an asset manager can pull together everybody else's money. It's kind of like we did at Bank to the Future, to get on the cap table, to then have strategic influence through shareholding. And then if you get enough shares, you control the board. And if you control the board, you control the executives. And if you build a derivatives complex and a media complex and an ETF complex, you control the markets. And so if they don't do what you say, you crash their share price. You push out media. You use a derivative complex in order to make them poor. Why? Because where is most people's net worth? It's paper net worth. It's not real net. It's not gold. It's not Bitcoin. It's not cash. It's securities. And what do? Someone like Elon Musk, you allow them to borrow against their securities to buy a platform like X, as long as you give them all the data and turn it into a social credit score in the end. And will allow you to use the media to manipulate the narrative to make people think that you're giving them freedom of speech, when in reality, you're getting people to talk to feed an AI algorithm to prop up real power. And if you don't do it, well, we're going to start mentioning you on the Epstein files. Or if you don't do it, we're going to crash your share price. And if you don't do it, you're not going to be able to borrow against your stock. And so it is all leverage. And so the whole illusion of net worth, again, is a subordination structure for power. The higher your net worth in this structure, the more subordinate you have to be in power in the world of financialization and securitization. But if you own actual hard money, Bitcoin, sovereign hard money, self-custody, then who do you answer to? You answer to, yeah. And if you have gold in self-custody, who do you answer to? Well, you answer to the structure of custodians because it doesn't scale. You know, you can't take a giant amount of net worth, and some people could build their own bunker or whatever it is that they do to own it in self-custody. That doesn't scale well, particularly if you can't co-opt a government and you need to leave. Or you just put it in somebody else's structure and then you become subordinate to the custodian. And the custodian's going to then leverage it to create more paper contracts and more derivatives. So all this to say is that it is in the exit that you're able to exit the system. Everything else is an optical illusion that draws you into a power structure. So I talked about the military industrial complex.
Yeah.
Where does the military get its money? Pentagon budgets, financialization and securitization, stock value. So who do they answer to? You know, if you want a Pentagon budget and you're Lockheed Martin, you buy the politicians. And so all the money, you get $1 trillion budget that's now going to be increased to $1.5 trillion because you own all the politicians. And in order to maintain that share price and gain access to the debt capital markets and the equity capital markets and the derivative complex, you answer to the banks. And so the banks control the military. They also control the technology companies. That's the technical industrial complex. Now you can have blackmail through data and algorithm, through surveillance. And these tools, these platforms are weaponized against us in order to create effectively this surveillance state. Now, what does power want? The power wants programmable money with a social credit score and artificial intelligence integrated military grade technology, financial weapons of mass destruction. So look at America right now around the Trump administration. Who's doing stablecoins and AI? David Sachs. He came from the PayPal mafia. Who's doing social credit score on the name of freedom of speech? Elon Musk, PayPal mafia. Who's doing AI contracts integrated into Ukrainian drones, occupation as a service in the West Bank using Palantir, genocide as a service in Gaza using Palantir, splitting up Ukraine for Russia and BlackRock, Palantir, creating a pre-crime arrest police state in UK, Palantir, doing crowd control and annual Hajj surveillance in Saudi Arabia, Palantir, doing border control in America under the guise of immigration, open borders, closed borders, Palantir, who's doing all of the European Union, stirring up racial tensions. All right, so X is trying to say, all these different religious tensions, racial tensions, white nationalist movements. These platforms, these social media platforms have become platforms for galvanizing radicalized ideology. You and me know exactly what happens when you galvanize a radicalized ideology and you feed them lies and mistruths. You know what that is. That is Israel and Palestine right now.
Yeah.
These algorithms are doing it to everybody right now. Let's say you're a white nationalist. You get put in the Nick Fuentes algorithm and all of your ideology pushes you down that route. Maybe you're a very extreme radical Zionist. Maybe you're believing that Iran is there just for Palestinian rights. You'll be pushed into the algorithm where it radicalizes you further into the most extreme version of yourself. Look at Democrats, Republicans, conservatives. It's laughable at this stage if you think that changing the politician changes the system. Yeah. And if you think that it's the radical left, socialist, communists that are your problem, and that, or you think that it's the fascist, extremist, conservatives is your problem right now, you don't know how power works. There is a unipower, and it is money that determines it. Everything. If you want to fund a militia group, it requires money and control of media to radicalize an ideology. And who do they work for? Who do these armies work for? You think you're working for nationalism in your country. No, you're working for JP Morgan. You're working for Lockheed Martin. You're working for General Dynamic. You're working for BlackRock. You're working for Palantir. Because the biggest weapon that they have is extremism and radicalized ideology, weaponizing religion and racial tensions in order to make you think that you're more moral when you're a useful idiot for power. And how do they reward you? They take your money, and when you borrow to get a mortgage, you help the bank create some dollars. And you end up with the debt, and they end up with the real estate. They own the real estate until you pay the mortgage. Then you've got to pay it 5 times over in interest. And if you don't pay that interest, you'll find out who owns the real estate. Okay? They get to create money just by you becoming a collateralized debt obligation. You are a product of debt. They need you working to pay your interest and never repaying your debt. Because if you repay your debt, the money comes out of the system and they need to find another useful idiot. So you are just simply a collateralized debt obligation. You are a mortgage-backed security. And then how do they pay the interest? Well, they need you to contribute to your pension so that they can pull together all the money. And then they buy these mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligation with your pension, with your insurance premiums, and with your overpriced education and endowment fund that they pay these education system to teach you the shit that poisons our food, turns doctors into drug dealers and turns economists into debt dealers. You know, they control the education system through these. It's just a money laundering organization. And the only people that get published are the one that are attached to a financial agenda. You know, so the whole system's wrapped up in an illusion of democracy, an illusion that your vote matters. It's a pay-to-play system. And the higher you get, the more compromised you have to be. That's what the Jeffrey Epstein files were. Now, what's the technical industrial complex? It is, as we said, it is the weaponization. What is all this technology originally created for? You think they just gave us iPhones and social media? Every single component in our iPhone, in the technology that we have to use, in our artificial intelligence, was originally innovated for killing people. And it required the quote unquote radical terrorists that are forced to fight for these ideologies to steal resources across 6 continents, to get the rare earth minerals, to get the energy, to get the components, to get the commodities that were effectively only achieved through death, destruction, genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, weapons trafficking, humans trafficking. You think these mafia networks operate without government? That's what the intelligence agencies get this money for. It's black op operations. They're trafficking our children in order to prop up a debt-based Ponzi scheme, in order to maintain power, to leave you with all the debt. Your job is to get all the debt, the national debt, the corporate debt, the individual debt. Well, they pump it all into the stock market, US stock market. 92% own, 92% of stocks are owned by 10% of the people. That are the very same people that you're seeing listed in an Epstein file. That are part of this compromise. So fiat currency is a proof of weapons network that weaponizes media, that weaponizes pharmaceuticals, that weaponizes technology, that weaponizes finance, that weaponizes military in order to roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And what are they, you nationalists, what are they going to do to your country once they bankrupt the government? What did the Bank of England do to the British government once they bankrupted it? They changed the empire. They reset the order. They put all the gold in the Federal Reserve rather than at the Bank of England. They create wars. They profit from the transition. And then they rebuild, and they rebuild back a surveillance state. So the entire fiat currency system is propped up by crimes against humanity in a debt-based Ponzi scheme that leaves you with all the debt and the power with all those that control the assets. It's a game of Monopoly. Everybody ends up with the debt, and a few people end up with all the real estate. And then they convert that real estate to hard assets, which is what they wanted in the first place. That was a short answer, wasn't
it? That was a perfect answer. I have so many follow-up questions to that, but I'll just do 1 or 2 of them. Do you think that there is any nation state today that is either not compromised or just compromised minimally, like the least as possible by those factions, or is the whole world screwed up? Is El Salvador or Bhutan or some of those places, do they have relative sovereignty, or is everyone fucked up in the same way?
I want to introduce you to Abundant Minds because they take a very different approach to Bitcoin mining. Never touch your Bitcoin or the psychology
into extremist ideology. We're either on the
potential. It addresses challenges.
Yeah, it's all relative.
Yeah. So we tend to go into, our brains have been trained into extremist ideology. We're either on the left or the right. It's either good or bad. There's no such thing in geopolitics. And with sovereign as well. I'm sovereign to the degree that I do things to become more sovereign.
Yeah.
But we can't be 100%.
But I'm still subordinate to my government structure. I'm still subordinate to a structure that means that I still own my property and it doesn't get stolen. So we all have degrees of power, no matter how sovereign. All we're trying to do is be more sovereign. Are we more sovereign or less sovereign with our decision making? And that's kind of the radar that people need to think about. So how do you become more sovereign? Well, you have a central banking system that opts out of the Bank for International Settlements control grid.
Is there such a country today? Who?
PBOC is one of those in China. So PBOC works under its own structure because it has community banks that create money. That money then fuels a sovereign structure that is then reinvested in its own people. That now some people would call that socialism, or would call it communism. Pick your whatever you want to do it. But that's an independent structure for creating fiat currency and being utilized to reinvest into your own people rather than working for bondholders that then props up foreign. So if you're investing it in treasuries, then you're propping up the dollar, which is the kind of the host of this proof of weapons network at the moment, in order to create the military that makes you subordinate. So your money is propping up a foreign military to make you subordinate to their structure. Or you have your own central banking structure in a fiat currency world. You then have your resources. Do your resources remain and go into a sovereign wealth fund? That sovereign wealth fund is your defense against foreign forces by using co-investments in order to ensure that your country has some leverage when it's negotiating with the financial terrorists. And you have to negotiate with them because they will destroy your currency. They will steal your resources. They will regime change you.
That's right. You had one of your recent episodes is like 5 currency wars, which I highly recommend people go and watch on your YouTube, where you just outline how right now we are witnessing 5 currency wars in different places around the world, where they're just coming in and sabotaging the country through the currency, right? Yeah,
including the internal civil war to create a technological industrial complex surveillance state stablecoin versus a legacy structure, and the technification of the Federal Reserve System under a different guise. So you have sovereign wealth through resources, you have central banking, and then you have your ability to resist against it. If you rely upon somebody else's military, if you rely upon somebody else's resources, if you rely upon somebody else's strategic choke points, the best you have is using your sovereign wealth in order to do a transaction that ensures you're not on the wrong side of the military industrial complex. That's the best you can hope for.
So in El Salvador, for example, they rely on the Federal Reserve for their money. They don't have their own currency even. So that's not a very high level of sovereignty in that case?
No, dollarization is complete subordination. And you resist it with a Bitcoin strategic reserve sovereign wealth fund.
Right.
But when I wanted to support President Bukele in launching a Bitcoin-backed bond, there was a whole reason why that didn't happen. And that didn't happen because you have to work for your bondholders, and your bondholders have other power structures.
Got it.
And so, there is just degrees of... Yeah. And if you want to know who's playing the game best, then what you do is you look up, do a chat GPT and list all the sovereign wealth funds that have the highest assets under administration. The best in Europe is Norway. The Middle East have a bunch of sovereign wealth. The best in the world is China in terms of their ability to dictate their future. And then you have different degrees, per capita and different other things. But the ones that are playing the game the best, that are the most free, are the ones that have the largest sovereign wealth fund. That doesn't mean complete.
And that doesn't mean that the people inside that nation have freedom.
No, so you got your country, right? So the island that I chose to live in, it's illegal to take on debt. So we have 0 bonds and 0 debt. What are the implications of that? And by the way, this doesn't scale. So the reason I do it, I found that my realization in the world is that community doesn't scale. As it gets bigger and bigger, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker. As the community gets smaller and smaller, it has the real bond and the real and so we've leveraged community to social media, but it helps. But the real community is still your small community around you of the people that are actually, I have to live on this ground. Are we going to turn this ground in my local area into a shithole, or are we going to work together to make it better? Okay. So there's kind of that factor. So I know that all money that I contribute and pay in tax goes to not interest, not bondholders, not debt holders, which is other people's agenda. think of the level of debt, the degree of subordination you are to power in the financial industrial complex. So America has $38 trillion of debt. It has to, right now, it has to favor its bondholders over its currency. So it is removing world reserve currency for its bondholders. That's what's happening in America right now. It's not autonomous. It's the least sovereign country in the world. It is fully subordinate to corporate power and foreign power. It's got $65 trillion of foreign ownership of assets. There's no people that think that Trump can make decisions. Trump works at his power structure, but he puts the illusion of autonomy. And so, because I know that all our taxpayer money goes actually to the community, I don't mind paying tax. Mm-hmm. It's contribution to the community. Mm-hmm. Is the government supporting the community? Are we having less crime or more crime? Are we having better supply chains or worse supply chains? Mm-hmm. Is people's happiness? Are people more happy or more depressed? Is there more drug addicts or are there less people that are addicted to drugs? Is there higher suicide rates or lower suicide rates? Is there more degeneracy or less degeneracy? What's the birth rate?
Exactly the things that you want to focus on.
Yeah, I just want a bunch of happy people around me that are having children, that feel accountable to, some kind of social contract, whether that be God or whether that be community or whatever is right for you, that holds you accountable, genuinely accountable to a higher purpose, that isn't committing suicide, isn't addicted to drugs, and is having children and has some family values because, that's what the government's meant to be doing. But no, it serves bondholders. And so that's why I moved to an island where I thought, where is that happening? And so the less debt, the more likely it is to happen because you're not servicing foreign interests. Underneath that, you have corporate structure. Yeah. So one of the best ways to protect yourself is to use corporate structure. The degree of autonomy that you have is, firstly, the balance sheet. Does the company have hard assets or paper assets? Is the money at a bank or is the money in self-custody? What level of cash flow do you need to meet your autonomy requirements? Do you have to raise more finance to get to the next stage? If you have to raise finance, you're subordinate to equity capital. If you need more debt, then you're subordinate to debt capital. And if you have to go public, then you're going to be subordinate to the investment banks. If you don't have cash flow, then you're going to have to look to somewhere else to get your capital. If you don't have assets on your balance sheet, then you're not going to be able to survive turbulence. And so, it's simple accounting at the corporate level. And then at the individual level as well, who do I owe money to? Who owns my property? Does the bank own it or do I own it? Who do I work for? If I take on if I'm borrowing against my Bitcoin, who's the custodian? Who gets a margin call me? Mm-hmm. Who controls the short-term price? And do I have reserve Bitcoin to meet that margin call? So the further you go down into these financial weapons of mass destruction, the less autonomy and less sovereignty you have. And so again, it's a spectrum. Yes. And my job is, in every decision, you should be asking, is this better or is this worse?
Yeah.
I'm not happy. I have to use an iPhone with AI on it.
Yeah.
But should I be running my own LLM? Yes, I know I should. Am I going to do it? Yes, eventually. I need to create an infrastructure. You ask yourself, do I own Bitcoin? Is that at Coinbase? Is that better than BlackRock? Or should I have it in self-custody? Have I got my self-custody structure yet? Okay, that might take me the next year to be comfortable, engage in the community, put together a plan. What's the tax consequences of me buying Bitcoin in an ETF and then trying to figure out selling that ETF, then taking the dollars, putting it in a bank, then getting the bank into an exchange, and then the exchange into buying Bitcoin, and then the Bitcoin off the exchange into self. Wow, that's a pretty complex process. So, okay, yeah, I want Bitcoin exposure, but should I try and get the right setup? Again, these are all decisions, and you'll get it wrong. I've made every mistake under the sun. I've been scammed by everybody. I've gone down the wrong routes, but in the end, you will be sovereign if you own your Bitcoin in self-custody, and then eventually, you're asking, well, am I subject to core developers? Do I trust these core developers? Am I subject to miners? And then you go down and understand how the ecosystem works. Okay, how do I get more sovereign? All right, maybe I want to run my own nodes. Maybe I actually want to vote. Maybe I want to verify my own transactions. Then you're like, what about miners? Maybe I want to do a bit of self-mining and connect to a more decentralized mining pool. Again, if you try and get this right from the beginning, you're going to be overwhelmed into perfection. And perfection is the mother of all, the enemy of all advancement.
Yes.
It's just, is this better or is it worse?
Yeah. I agree with you 100%. Okay, I want to get to at least two more things with you before we have to get off. So one of the things you shared is that in the beginning of your career journey is you worked in City of London, and you have the lived experience of how the compromise is being done, whether it's, so that's what I'm curious on. Blackmail, extortion, threats, like, have you seen all that stuff? And at the high political or institutional levels, are they really exposed to all that and they have to be exposed to it if they want to advance? Or is it possible to stay clean when they're at that level? And I want to know if it's real. Look, we're seeing this with the Epstein files now, but it kind of feels like it's them over there, these elites, so that elite class that we are not connected to. But you've seen it from the financial side and in the City of London. How does it work there? Is it really like that everywhere, even the lower levels?
No, the higher you want to rise within these control grids, the more compromised you have to be. If you want Trump's job, you got to be very compromised. If you want to do what Thomas Massey's doing right now, you need to work for a level of power that benefits from the Epstein files being released. And if you want to take Trump's job, all of that ideology is going to go away. So if you want Thomas Massey, as he is today, to be president, impossible, ain't going to happen. If you want to be included in the S&P 500, Michael Saylor, you know what you have to face in order to get there, because you are doing it within a Wall Street construct. If you want to be an executive of an investment bank, then the way that compromise, and by the way, Epstein is taking the toll right now. I'll give you why I think it is. It's because I think it's part of the strategic weakening of the dollar operation. They're trying to destroy America right now and turn it into a civil war. And they're also trying to defang some of the radical ideologies and expose some of the Israeli deep state, the American deep state, the evangelical Christians that are saying, you've got this generational thing where the boomers were radicalized into this evangelical Christian ideology to support Zionism, which is a tool for the military industrial complex, if you haven't figured it out. Like, people think like Israel rules the world. Now, Israel is subordinate to its own corrupt power structure, just like America is, just like UK is, just like the rest of the West is. And the military industrial complex has these blackmail operations and various other things. Now, people think it's like Jeffrey Epstein is like a one-off. There's thousands of Jeffrey Epsteins. There's thousands of them. And his job was to demonstrate utility to the network. And the more utility you can demonstrate to the network by persuading people, or not even persuading, providing services for sick people that are so rich that they've hit the level of the only thing that gives me more satisfaction is using my money to engage in worse and worse crimes against humanity, to the point where I become so extreme that I'm doing things that I don't even want to talk about right now. These networks of Jeffrey Epstein. Okay, so you want to be introduced to this person. Well, to get to those levels, how do we know that you're going to be the right type of person? Well, first, let's just start with some money. So I'll invest in your company. Then once I invest in your company, let's build a relationship. Hey, by the way, do you want to come to one of my house? I got some escorts there. Go enjoy yourself. And then you take them further and further down the chain. And if you want to get to the top, you've got things that are on Hunter Biden's laptop. You've got paths that we know about Trump. You've got emails from Elon Musk making orders on Epstein Island while pretending Jeffrey Epstein was trying to get him on the island. You've got Howard Lutniks, that are pretending that this was some sick individual while he was listing the age of his children and going to the island, and suddenly you're protected. There's only one. I tell you how I know this. In 2016, there was a hack of Bitfinex for 120,000 Bitcoin. And I decided that we would use our structure to help the victims. And we put together a structure, a security token that meant that it didn't need to go into bankruptcy. And we made a construct that compensated victims many times over. But we ended up a shareholder in Bitfinex. And we saw what happened to Tether. It was weaponized by taking out banks. Regulations were used in order to create a hole. That hole then led to a financial construct where lawfare was then used. Lawfare is then used in order to compromise you further and further. And as you get compromised further and further and further, you have a choice. Your choice is die or grow. You get taken out if you don't continue to be useful to power, or you corrupt further. And then you end up with Cantor Fitzgerald holding all of your bonds. And now you're deep into the system. And you decide that you want to become as big as Tether is. you don't get to play those games without being part of power. You don't get to survive. And so same in the career in this finance side. So the answer is, I'm sorry, I'm very black-pilled. Everywhere I look, I see the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there is an empowerment in understanding how the system works. There's a disappointment in delusion. Because you either ignore this shit and then you become a part of the problem, a cog in a wheel, or you understand the problem so that you can boycott it and exit. Yeah. And I know that there are parts, because I understand how the system works, I know there are part of my life that has to be a part, my money at a bank is contributing to evil. Mm-hmm. Point blank. I know it, but I still need some money at a bank to not have currency risk. You know, so various things. It's again, I know that for me to have this technology, I'm participating in evil, but that technology hopefully makes me more productive, where I can reallocate some of that energy and money into something that might actually make a difference. And this comes down to, I think, a spiritual thing.
Yeah.
I think this is how I think the world works. In my map of the world, you don't understand good until you can't understand good without evil. And so evil is the polar opposite of good, and you need all of it. And the world is not meant to eliminate all evil. We are just presented with evil and good. And then we have a choice. And our choice is, do I continue? Do I ignore? Or do I make an intent to do a better decision? And that's a test. And one day we all meet our maker and we have to explain whether we passed the test or failed the test. And so I don't think you fix the world. I don't think Bitcoin fixed the world, but I think it gives you an option to exit. And I think it gives you an option to boycott. And I think it gives you an option to take that energy and channel your money into something that is better. And my experience has been, every time I've made that decision, I remember borrowing against my Bitcoin through Celsius, thinking it's a good idea rather than selling some Bitcoin. And I got punished to take that energy and channel your money into something that is better. And my experience has been, every time I've made that decision, I remember borrowing against my Bitcoin through Celsius, thinking it's a good idea rather than selling some Bitcoin. And I got punished for it. You know, I spent the next 2 years of my life helping victims. It was the most educational experience. It made the fabric of my understanding of how the world works. Because I lent into it. I made the wrong decision and the world gave me that test. And my test was, do I just become the elite and just say, okay, I'll sit in the background and do nothing? Or do I use this in order to support the other people, just like my father? And during the Celsius bankruptcy, it was June the 12th, 2022. My father passed away the same day that Celsius shut the doors on 650,000 people, a $25 billion Ponzi scheme. And shortly after that, when I came out and said, you know what, I just found out I'm the 7th largest creditor in this bankruptcy. Mizhinsky stole money and, he owes me 45 million. I borrowed against some Bitcoin. It's not going to change my life. But I got message after message from people that had put their entire life savings into this thing. I met people that committed suicide because they couldn't face their wife and tell them they'd lost their whole lifetime savings. I met people that moved country because they couldn't afford to live. And they had to figure out how to, because they thought the money was about to come back. And they were waiting week after week thinking, it's coming, it's coming. They couldn't face the reality of what had happened to them. I had pensioner after pensioner that needed to come out of retirement because Mizhinsky told them, put everything here. Put your entire, they emptied out their 401k, bought a stable coin and lent the whole thing thinking that they were getting a safe yield. Mizhinsky went, I had a pensioner that went to Miami, looked Mizhinsky in the face and said, this is everything I've got. I need this money. Is it safe to do this? He didn't say, this is a risky hedge fund. You know, you should only put a small allocation into this. He said, put it all in, do everything. And, there were people that reminded me of my father. My father passed away on that day. And I said, I got to continue this mission.
Yeah.
I got to continue this work and help people understand what happened to their money. And so for 2 years, I read 4,000 court documents. I publicly described everything. I participated in the court process, managed to get the judge not to sell people's Bitcoin. In FTX, they sold all the Bitcoin, managed to get it out of bankruptcy so they didn't steal all the upside of the Bitcoin, and discovered 2 years of this sheer corruption that was involved in the bankruptcy process. And I think it was the vital training that kind of led to, the next phase of understanding and being involved in anti-war advocacy. And
thank you so much for sharing what you shared. Do you think that the reason Daniel Leon is not with the same verdict as Mashinsky is because of his subordination to powers in Israel? Like, to me, it's just my mind, I cannot comprehend how this guy can be now free and just doing his next startup with everything that has happened. What do you think? Why is that?
So this is when I really first discovered, this power structure and dynamic around the jurisdiction of Israel. Firstly, you get you expose power, and the first thing Alex Mashinsky's wife did is weaponized anti-Semitism and said that I'm anti-Semitic. That's the first thing you find out that happens. Mm-hmm. Then I looked into the real structure. It turns out that there was a back office in Israel, in Celsius. The co-founder, Daniel Leon, has now got an AI startup with the Prime Minister's Office of Israel. He didn't go to prison. He was in Israel. His wife is effectively propaganda for the IDF and social media. I looked into one of the hacks that happened. It was through a company called Bancor DAO. And Bancor DAO, the shareholders were the niece and nephew of Benjamin Netanyahu. Victims' money was used to make an acquisition of a company called GK8, which is a custody service located in Israel. And the only person...
GK8 has managed to be acquired a second time after it lost money, like miraculously. It's a success story. There are no miracles in that industry. That doesn't happen just because, God loves them. So for people to understand. And the Ben-Alzi family is behind Bancor DAO. Ben-Alzi is the cousin of Netanyahu.
Okay, thank you for that.
I mean, Sarah Netanyahu, which is Netanyahu's wife, her brother, I think his name is Amatzia Ben-Alzi. He's an investor in many companies in Israel, including Bancor DAO. And his children, the boy and the girl, they're both in Bancor DAO. So they're more or less my age. Yeah.
Interesting.
And so they're protected. So this is what I'm thinking of. I'm looking at Daniel Leon, I'm looking at the whole case. I'm looking at how one person only gets, a verdict of 12 years in prison and the other one has nothing, and he's a co-founder. And I'm searching him in the Israeli media and news. He's celebrated as this tech entrepreneur, but what about the accountability? What about I don't know, how come he's walking free and the other one is in jail? So,
Yeah, each one of those suicides, each one of those ruin of life, each one of those pensioners where their whole life was destroyed, you did that, Daniel Leon. And you need to be accountable to that, but you won't be because you have got your shelter.
That's what I feel, yeah.
And, Alex Mashinsky went down for 12 years, but there was a whole power structure behind him as well.
Of course.
And so, this was really the kind of one of the another experience going through a 2-year bankruptcy process and going, I kind of go all in at each stage and it kind of builds your building, it adds to your building blocks. And so
of course
we could go down a million different routes from here.
We have to do another part if you will allow me, because I have so many questions from the audience that they would like to get your answers, but we don't have time for it now. So at a later point, I would love to do another part. I will, just take you to one more direction, which is I think important to some of my audience, and I want to be responsible and sensitive and apologize in advance if this is going to trigger some people, because if you're like me, Jewish and Israeli, but you are still connected to your national or religious identity in some way, then it may be hard for you to hear how things are working in and around Israel. And one of the things I really found fascinating is that a lot of the things you said around October 7th or the Iran 12 days war, things that are related to Israel and the Middle East specifically, were very similar to the things I was saying, but obviously I do not have your background and experience in terms of following the money and bringing the receipts from that side. I was saying all that stuff from a very, first of all, intuitive place, but secondly, my lived experience and the evidence that I was collecting from the ground, and I also served in the IDF. So I had a very personal experience of being there, seeing how things work, knowing how the system is supposed to work versus how it was actually operating on October 7th. I actually did a lot of documenting and reporting about that specific incident because I had so much experience to talk about it. And after I've done that, I've been called names, and people, they can't call me an anti-Semite, so they call me a self-hating Jew. There's such a thing. But what I find really interesting is when I look at Zionism, our system indoctrinates you to conflate Zionism with patriotism. And when you're educated, when you're a child and a teenager, you have this environment that's teaching you that being a Zionist is really being a patriot and being a good person. And so most of the people in Israel, they do not understand that Zionism is a political movement and what the aim of that movement is. And they haven't gone back in history to source its origins and why it operates the way it is and what kind of powers it's subordinate to. And so for me, growing up, I had this cognitive dissonance with being like lefty, a left-wing person, wanting peace with the Arabs in Palestine, and at the same time understanding that there is such a thing as an occupation of another, other people. Like you're being a lefty, and you want to love your country and be a good patriot and be a Zionist, but how can you be both? How can you both, be a left-wing and want to respect other people's right to exist and you don't want to control them, you want them to have their own autonomy, but at the same time, you're being told that you have to be a good boy or good girl and be a good Zionist. And so I could never settle the two, and the propaganda in Israel is so powerful. So when I came out and spoke about October 7th, I kind of understood how powerful the powers that are operating within Israel are, because even though I had known about some of the past history with the Yom Kippur War 50 years earlier to October 7th, I saw it with my own eyes, how the government or the security apparatus had enabled something like this to happen. And that shook me to the ground, because I knew without a shadow of a doubt that this was enabled, because from my experience, this is not supposed to happen. And I have all the receipts for that. And then I see someone like you that then goes to the other side and and obviously everything that I'm a little bit mixed up, but what I'm seeing is that after October 7th, the whole thing that unfolded was predictable in my eyes. I said that this was enabled just so that we can go into Gaza and finish what we started, because Gaza was becoming a liability, and that they just want to create a new Middle East kind of order with foreign powers to come back again and negotiate how the region's going to look like. And Israel is a very important strategic asset in that negotiation. So this had to happen at one point, and now is the time for it to happen. And people were sacrificed on both sides. They have no care for human lives. And then you start the anti-Semitism card, just like you said that you were weaponized personally by that lady telling you straight away that you're an anti-Semite if you're starting to criticize the government of Israel. And then it becomes a global thing and everyone's anti-Semite, and then it's a whole problem. And then you have all these false flag operations that are happening around the world that are justifying even more that there's anti-Semitism. And I'm not saying that there isn't, there is, but it's just being sparked and it's being created at a certain time to serve a certain goal. And then you get the whole world saying, oh, it's because the Zionism are the evil of the world, and Israel and the Jewish people are controlling the world. And, and there you have it. You kind of achieved something, which I don't understand why they do it. From my lived experience, it is not possible for Israel to control the world or Zionism to control the world. Yes, they have a lot of power. And yes, I am the first one to criticize the place where I'm coming from. But there is such a level of degeneracy and mediocrity in Israel and in Zionism that there is no way that small cabal can manage the world or control the world. It just doesn't work that way. That's why your theory of this interwoven complex of relationship between the three different complexes with different facets of power operating differently in Israel and in other places in the Middle East and in the world makes so much more sense for me than that theory of, the Jews and the Zionists just control the world. So I'm sorry that was a long rant, but I kind of wanted to compare notes with you on that.
Yeah, we could almost do a whole podcast on that.
I know.
And we probably should. Why not?
Sure.
But so cognitive dissonance is the right word. So firstly, you have to understand how the world really works. Like Netanyahu has a job, and his job isn't to work for Israel, even though most people think it is. He might as well work for Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, and various other power structures, and the Israeli military-industrial complex. Yeah. So, he has a power structure, and people think that the president or the prime minister is in charge. They're not in charge. Their job is a battering ram for power. Their job is to do what power, who they work for, is telling them to do, and they have to find an acceptable way of presenting that to the public-facing people. So Trump doesn't rule America. Trump's job is to repackage massive policy into MAGA and make people think this is nationalistic in the interest of the average American. That's his job. In the meantime, who does he work for? He works mainly for the financial industrial complex, who strategically is a global transnational capital. And no, it's not Israel. And Israel doesn't run the Federal Reserve. There is transnational capital, is the countries that use their resources to build sovereign wealth, that partner with a central banking structure, which is the Bank for International Settlements. The Bank for International Settlements is the higher the GDP of your country, the bigger a shareholder you become. And so the largest node is the Federal Reserve. So then you have a plausible deniability story, right? The Federal Reserve is the most important node in the Bank for International Settlements. Now, if you want to create a blame shift story, you say the Bank for International Settlements, that's the Brits and the Europeans, and Trump is taking on the legacy banking structure. That's a narrative, okay? The Federal Reserve is the most important node in the Bank for International Settlements. Who owns the Federal Reserve? And then we'll get back to how it comes to Israel. The banks. So the shareholders of the Federal Reserve are the banks. What are the banks? They're public companies. What are public companies? They're owned by the asset managers as the largest shareholders. Who are the asset managers? Well, the largest pools of capital, like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and a bunch of foreign sovereign wealth funds. And so capital at the end of the day is you got to look at the shareholder class. Who are the shareholders in those? Well, legacy power. You know, this is where you go down and you realize that there's wealthy families and they have trust structures via Cayman Islands and all of these trust structures. So legacy power, was the Rothschild dynasty a very powerful force? Yes, but we're not in the 19th century anymore. This is in the 18th and 19th century. There is remnants of that power, but they represented European power. European power has been strategically weakened. There was, with the rise of the American empire, a whole Rockefeller and JP Morgan, and they connected with European power in order to manage this transition. That built wealth within the US military industrial complex, within the technical industrial complex. And so you have shifts in power and relative power based upon your wealth. Some of them ended up with a bunch of gold, others ended up with a bunch of debt, okay? So you have this network of wealth that is the shareholder class, and they are able to influence their holdings through their shareholdings and board positions. Okay, but then what happened? We had globalism. What did globalism lead to? The rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of other powers, the rise of sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East. And so because the Middle East, some countries were able to utilize their oil, they were able to build a sovereign wealth fund and partner with the financial industrial complex. Other countries, they gained their power by being connected to the military industrial complex. Israel went through that transition. It was originally a land where Jewish people, Muslim people, and Christians lived in relative peace. There was an Ottoman Empire. There's 3,000 years of history, but none of that's relevant. That's narrative. You know, there were people on that land, and Jews, Muslims, and Christians didn't really hate each other. But then you had foreign interference from the British Empire. You had Turkish interference from an Ottoman Empire. You had power dynamics, and you had financial families like the Rothschilds that back certain factions of power. There were wars, and there were terrorist groups that received weapons. They were called Haganah. They became the IDF. They also were narratived into an ideology, because you don't recruit an army. A power doesn't recruit an army of, like, look at right now, there's no ideology in UK, and the British army is useless. It's just technology and military and manufacturing. But there's no Brit that wants to ideologically fight for its country and Ukraine and all this stuff, because you need ideology to recruit power, and religious ideology was the most important power. You know, the original Europeans that came to America, they were doing a genocide and ethnic cleansing because they thought that they were the chosen Christians and they were escaping religious persecution. And, you know, and therefore they were okay genociding and ethnically cleansing the Native Americans for power. And those power were, you know, the wealthy and rich that were building everything that gave the American empire its later power. All right, so you had, you know, Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Palestine that was occupied by the British Empire after the Ottoman Empire, and you had a narrative. And you had power that were pulling the strings. And power was funding militia groups, creating false flags, and creating an environment that led to wars. Those wars were profitable to power. There were people that would gain financial interest, that would gain power. It became an outpost for power to have a jurisdiction in order to engage in activities that couldn't be done in other countries. And Israel effectively became an outpost for the US military industrial complex. And then there were power within America. There is, just like there's an Italian mafia, there's a Jewish mafia. They're in New York. And that Jewish mafia is utilizing its power to utilize Israel in order to get away with it, any crimes against humanity, wrap it up in jurisdictional arbitrage, just like Daniel Leone did, and utilize that power. It needs to become useful to power. What utility does it do? Well, maybe it becomes a testing ground for weapons. Maybe it becomes a testing ground for managing the surveillance state and an occupation. Maybe there are companies within Israel that can profit from that, gain access to Pentagon budgets, take that money, test technology that couldn't be tested in America, test it in Israel, train and fund militia groups, fuel religious tensions by funding Western-backed proxies like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, have infiltration of Turkey, of Iran, of Saudi Arabia, of all these different countries, and use Israel and use Iran and use Turkey and use Saudi and use all these countries as a divide and conquer mission so that the American empire can grow. That money then gets recycled. The debt remains with the American people. Every war creates trillions of dollars of revenue. You have plausible deniability. You can at every stage say it wasn't us, it was them. But then you also radicalize people. You radicalize Muslims by manufacturing wars and creating false flag operations, which 9/11 was. You then radicalize Jews into thinking that they're fighting for their survival. And then you radicalize evangelical Christians in America to create the religious justification for the war, thinking you're defending democracy. And now you've got a radicalized Christian group, a radicalized Muslim group, and a radicalized Jewish group that are all useful idiots to power. Mix them all up, shake it all up, and you can destabilize the Middle East so that they can't build sovereign wealth. You are forced onto the petrodollar. You assassinate King Faisal or anything like that tries to resist power. You then create a shadow government called Safari Club, which works for CIA, Mossad, MI6. And then you funnel all the money back into propping up the US stock market and the Israeli stock market. The average people end up with the debt. You privatize all the companies, put them on the stock market, and then you prop up the dollar, you prop up the petrodollars. So at the power level, that's what's happening. At the government level, they work for power. They don't work for the people. Their job is to put an acceptable narrative to get population growth, recruit an army, make them think that everything they're doing is noble, deserved, justified, spiritual, religious, when really you're doing incredible evil activities for power without knowing who you work for. It's the concept of a useful idiot. Most people don't know who they work for. Most people have no idea because this is all done by plausible deniability, shadow funding structures. There are a bunch of people that believe that they are fighting a resistance. But what's the Iranian model? The Iranian and Israel conflict made trillions of dollars for the US and Israeli military industrial complex. It also created a shadow mafia sanctioned mafia network where the people in power in Iran benefit from strategic tension. Now, most people think they're resisting. They are useful idiots for power. Others think that they're part of some radicalized Islamist state thing. Useful idiots for power, got nothing to do with Islam. These are CIA operatives. You saw that. Look at Gilani, the person that used to head up ISIS is now the head of Syria, meeting in the White House. And Syria is basically funded by, the Gulf Cooperation Council in Turkish interests. Now, because he used to work for ISIS, which is connected to covert Israeli, Mossad operations, people think he works for Israel. But no, he works for Turkey and the GCC. Now, all this to say is that I could go on forever, and I do go on every week. I cover this, what's really happening by following the money. All this to say is that the most useful power is divide and conquer, and division is always the mechanism that power profits from. And those, Netanyahu's just a middle person. He's an indispensable asset. He can be replaced. He can be assassinated. He can be regime changed. If he doesn't do what the military industrial complex want him to do, and there was a mission, which is get rid of the Palestinians. Here's your job description. How do you do it? Well, October the 7th was very useful to try and get rid of the Palestinians. And so you allow October the 7th to happen. And if you don't think that false flags are, done for military profits, then you don't know how the world really works. because all of those wars in the Middle East made someone trillions of dollars. Where's the debt? The debt is the American person. The value is in the US stock market. And there are a bunch of corruption in the middle that all got their cut for being useful to power. And so Netanyahu doesn't work for the Israeli people. I mean, if you really think about it, Zionism and Israel as an ideology is probably the worst thing that could ever happen to the Jewish people from my perspective, because it's just population growth for power, where you join the IDF and then you have to engage in covert operations, the ethnic cleansing, and acquisition of resources via the Israeli and US military industrial complex to divide and conquer. Effectively, you're just being used for power.
So I've been part of it. I was in the IDF. I saw with my own eyes what wars are for and how it's working. And I'm the living experience of that thing. It's not worth it for anyone. But when you propagandize people so well, you can use them. And yes, Zionism and the project called the State of Israel, which I am part of, and it is my home, and I will return there to my family and friends. It doesn't make me love the place less by saying it, but it is a very bad experiment. It is a very bad project. And I believe that my grandparents were manipulated and duped to be Zionists and to want to fight for that country and to build it. And I'm not saying that the Jewish people don't need a place or don't need protection, but it's just that project benefit on the backs of millions of people that don't even know that they are being played.
The only reason that the brand of Zionism effectively turned into what I call a toxic asset is because power decided to show people what it was. Mm-hmm. And so the ethnic cleansing that happened to the Palestinians and the crimes against humanity and the attempted but failed genocide, from my perspective, I know that these might be triggering words, sorry for your audience, but I believe that that's what was meant to happen because Netanyahu had a job description and he failed with that job description. Mm-hmm. But it's because the military industrial complex, which is who he worked for, was actually having a power struggle with the financial industrial complex. And the financial industrial complex wants regional stability in the Middle East. Why? Because they're taking the tactics that they used in the Middle East and the global South and Asia, and they're bringing it back home to America right now because they want to usher in a police and surveillance state. So they need civil unrest in America, in UK, in Europe. They're taking the same tactics, and this is only 1% of it. If you think in the UK and America and in the West is bad right now, that quote unquote invasion was effectively people that are their countries were destroyed to prop up this dollar-based system. And they wanted some opportunity, so they ended up in America. And now they've escaped their country, probably at the time when their country is going to go through growth, because the financial industrial complex is dumping the dollar right now and dumping America in partnership with the sovereign wealth funds, propped up by oil purchases of China to build this AI and surveillance police state that we're all building and participating in right now. And so transnational capital decided that it needs to purge some of its assets. And so there was a power struggle between the military industrial complex, which was the Greater Israel Project to destabilize the region, and the financial industrial complex that partnered with the sovereign wealth funds that said we need regional stability. Mm-hmm. And it's only because China rose that the American military had to negotiate via the financial industrial complex with China, because China's providing all the revenue with its manufacturing base for those sovereign wealth funds by buying oil. That gave them more power. And the financial industrial complex decided it's time to reset the order because we burdened the West with all the debt. And now we're asset stripping the West. And now we're just going to use them as the laboratory of Palantir technology that was tested in Gaza, that was tested in the West Bank. And so all the beta tests that were put on the global South are now coming home. And they're only going to give you 1% of it. People are freaking out right now. They're going mentally insane in the West, not having children, higher suicide rates, highest drug addictions, highest rates or lowest birth rates, highest mental illness, like degeneracy, more OnlyFans prostitution, men that are addicted to pornography and can't have children, technology to destroy the family base, massive gambling, crypto scamming, like poly market, prediction market, all rampant degeneracy. Yeah. Because they're experiencing 1% of what the US military industrial complex did to the rest of the global South. And now they're reallocating their profit centers. And so, Netanyahu didn't meet his job description. And now he's trying to prove his utility by acquiring more land so that Western financial industrial complex can negotiate with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and the BRICS countries that are now a rising power. And now the Middle East will most likely end up in regional stability because they managed to find a financial transaction that was more profitable than the death and destruction. And that's why the dollar's weakening right now, because transnational capital is weakening the dollar to reset the world order.
Yeah. We have to do another episode just about that, because there's so much more to dig here. But your prediction is that Israel and maybe Palestine are going to be controlled by the GCC going forward?
Yeah, I think what we're witnessing right now, at the moment, we're on off with US war with Iran. Netanyahu's visiting US right now. The narrative is that Netanyahu rules the world. He's middle management. He's a dispensable asset.
Of course.
And when you go to meet, so the narrative is that if you meet, oh, right, he rules the world, so he's visited Trump 8 times. When you are a world leader and everything's going the way you want it, you don't go and visit another world leader.
Oh, yeah.
You have to visit.
It's like going to the principal's office.
Yeah, you have to visit 8 times because things ain't going the way you want.
Absolutely.
And you have to try and fix the thing that's not going the way you want it to go. But people create this whole narrative. I wrote a blog called Do Jews Rule the World that goes through all the power dynamics and just trying to put people into realism. Look, all this to say, we should go deeper. These are all interesting topics in understanding how the world works. But Iran is effectively economically dependent upon China right now. Israel has been turned into a pariah state hated by the rest of the world in many respects. That's a generational thing. And I think that both Palestine and Israel are going to be vassalized economically into the GCC while Iran becomes a dependency. And I think Iran has shared all its proxies already. And essentially at this stage, there is a vision for the region. And that vision is set by transnational capital, which is China, the sovereign wealth funds, and the US financial industrial complex. They want peace in the Middle East to make more money. And so that's my prediction for what happens over the next 5 years. And quite frankly, I prefer that to the military ruling the region.
Absolutely.
Even though I think it's unjust, but I can shout all I want. I just follow the money, and the money says this ain't going to be justice, but it's going to be better than what it was before. And so, you know, I look forward to. I believe the Middle East will be the highest growth region in the next decades ahead. I think China is on track to become a superior economic power than America. I think the West is being asset stripped. The governments are fully subordinate to power. And I think the global South is going to have its opportunity to rise, but your proximity to America, i.e. Europe, Latin and Central America, are where the military is going to make up for lost profit, sadly. And so they want to profit from war the closer you are to the Western hemisphere, while they're asset stripping and creating civil unrest in order to usher in this technocratic police and surveillance state. And so sadly, you could say sadly, but I believe that, again, spiritual money means that there are consequences to what's been inflicted on the world. And that has to come home to roost by the real power, which I believe is divine. And these are tests. And how we react to these things, do we do good with it? Do we do bad with it? Do we speak truth even when it hurts us? You know, and that's our test. And often we have to speak truth to things that are very destructive and very harmful to our self-interest.
Yeah.
But I think that's the test. And then you have to allocate your money and decide, am I going to be a part of this or am I going to be able to exit it? And so in the end, for me, Bitcoin has become a mission of, I think Bitcoin in custody has been co-opted by power, and we don't take down the system, but we do get to exit from the system and become sovereign ourselves, because elites want Bitcoin in self-custody, but they want you to custody it, and they want you in debt, borrowing against it and becoming a degenerate altcoin gambler. That's what they want. So you just need to do the opposite of what they want.
You're a living example of what you were saying, because even if it's not in your best interest, you still speak the truth. And the way you have taken your life's mission and purpose, and you're just in service to the community and to humanity by doing what you're doing. So I'm wrapping up this part 1 of us speaking, because I'm looking forward to the next opportunity where we can sit down and I can pick your brain even more and ask you all the audience questions I have. But I give you a huge virtual hug and big thank you for everything you do. I think you are amazing, and thank you for doing what you're doing. And I look forward to staying in touch and doing it again.
Yeah, no problem. The challenge is people can't get nuance. They really want, we've been indoctrinated, particularly in the West, in order to pick a team and just go with our team no matter what happens. The reality is that countries can be simultaneously enemies and friends at the same time in different areas. And geopolitics doesn't work like humans. You know, And there are times when Iran and Israel is working together. You can see that in Iran-Contra affair. They benefit from intelligence sharing in certain things. But here's the thing. The boogie monster is never how the world really works. Everything in media is a function of who controls that media and what do they want you to believe. There's no independent media. Algorithms are what they need you to be radicalized into in this new world. And everything a politician says is the complete opposite of reality. The only truth, even in the Epstein files, you've got a bunch of emails, but the truth is the financial transactions. And you're not going to get those because that incriminates the people that actually control the Epstein files. And it's not Trump and it's not the Department of Justice. I can assure you it's greater powers that are still using it. So we'll continue in another, but it's in the nuanced conversations is what I wanted to say, that if you find yourself tribal, you're probably a useful idiot. Because everyone, when you tell the truth, everyone hates you. Look, I'm very emotionally connected to the Palestinian cause, but am I going to continue lying about things because it helps the cause? No. All we can do is help people understand the nuance, because other people are weaponizing the cause. And if you give energy to those that are weaponizing the cause, then you're continuing the problem and you're not helping solve the problem. And in doing that, everyone will hate you. I guarantee you, every side, because if we don't, is going to hate us from this conversation. But who cares? Like, who cares?
Exactly. Who cares? I always say I'm on team human. I don't give a fuck about all this left, right, and
that's what Bitcoin was. It was FU money in the end of the day. Yeah. My company is free, I'm free, and my country is as free as it can be. So that's what allows me to talk to this stuff. And I will never commit suicide in case I don't come back, by the way. Somebody would take me out if they did. I don't think I'm that important. But I'm definitely having conversations. So if I disappear, it's not because I commit suicide.
Yeah, same here. I learned so much from you. So keep going, please. You're doing amazing work.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Simon. People should follow you. I will tell you. On X, on Author, you are not very active, but you have an account. And the SimonDixon.com website, everything is there. And the YouTube channel is magnificent. So you can follow Simon in all of these channels. And there's a newsletter, website. You can sign up and get his stuff also by email. So did I cover everything?
Yeah, and I'm meant to be promoting my podcast now as well. So Apple and Spotify as well. Just put in Simon.
Apple
Dixon.
And Spotify. Simon Dixon Hard Talk. Bitcoin Hard Talk. You rebranded.
I end up talking 5% about Bitcoin because it's a solution.
It's a solution,
and 95% about everything else.
So it's Simon Dixon Hard Talk. Go follow the podcast on Apple and Spotify. Thank you so much. We're going to do this again. Hopefully next time also in real life. So in person. That would be a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you.